When we talk about consciousness, we usually think of it as the part of us that knows what we're doing, feeling, or thinking. It's the part of your mind that says, I'm aware I'm sitting in this chair, or I'm thinking about lunch. But what happens when that awareness turns inward? What happens when you try to observe your own consciousness? Who exactly is watching, and what is being watched? This is the self-observer paradox. It asks a simple but deep question. If consciousness observes itself, who is doing the observing, and who is being observed? To understand this, let's start with a basic idea. When you look at something outside of yourself, like a tree, there's a clear split. You are the observer, and the tree is the thing you observe. There's a subject and an object. But when you turn your attention inward, this split gets blurry. You are both the subject and the object at the same time. That's where things get strange. Imagine standing in front of a mirror. You see yourself, but what you see is not actually you. It's a reflection. You know it's just an image. You can't touch it, and it can't act on its own. Still, you get useful information from it. Your face, your clothes, your posture. Now imagine that instead of seeing your body in the mirror, you try to see your own thoughts. You try to watch your own awareness. You sit down, close your eyes, and think, I'm aware. But the moment you think that, who or what is aware of the thought, I'm aware? Is it the same awareness that made the thought, or something separate? This leads to a loop. You notice a thought, then notice yourself noticing that thought, then notice yourself noticing yourself noticing. It can keep going. This is what people mean when they say consciousness seems recursive. It loops back on itself. This isn't just an abstract idea. You can try it right now. Sit quietly and try to watch your own awareness. Don't focus on any thoughts or sounds. Just try to sense the part of you that knows you are alive. Almost instantly, your mind might start saying things like, I'm doing it, or is this it, or what am I looking for? Those are thoughts, but who or what notices those thoughts? And who notices the part of you that noticed? This kind of self-observation seems to split the self in two, but both parts feel like you. There isn't a clear line between the observer and the observed. You don't feel like two people. You feel like one, looking at yourself. One way to explain this is to say that consciousness is both the mirror and the reflection. When you turn inward, you don't become two separate things. Instead, you use the same system, the same conscious awareness, to examine itself. This would be like using a flashlight to shine light on itself. That sounds impossible, but with consciousness, it somehow works, or at least seems to. Neuroscience has tried to tackle this. Brain scans show that certain areas of the brain light up when people focus on their inner experience. But the scans don't show two separate centers, one observing, one being observed. Instead, we see overlapping systems. Memory, attention, emotion, and sense of self all work together. There's no little person inside your head looking at another little person. There's just one brain doing many things at once. Some psychologists call this meta-awareness. It's the ability to be aware of your own awareness. It's useful. You use it when you realize you're daydreaming in a meeting and bring yourself back, or when you catch yourself getting angry and decide to take a breath. In those moments, you're not just aware of what you're doing, you're aware that you're aware. That gives you the power to change course. Let's take a simple example. Say you're driving and start thinking about dinner. Then you realize you haven't been paying attention to the road. That realization is meta-awareness. You noticed your mind drifting and brought it back. You observed your own mental state. But here's the catch. The part of you that noticed the drifting mind is not separate from the drifting mind. It's the same system catching itself in the act. So, who's the observer? It's still you. And what's being observed? Also you. There's no clean line. You can compare this to a computer running a program that monitors its own performance. The program checks how much memory it's using or whether it's running smoothly. But the monitor program is still part of the same machine. It's not something extra. Consciousness might work the same way. It checks on itself without becoming something separate from itself. In meditation practices, especially in traditions like mindfulness or certain schools of Buddhism, people spend years trying to observe the mind without getting caught in thoughts. They train to watch thoughts come and go without chasing them. But even in deep states of meditation, where people say they feel like pure awareness, the question still comes up: who is feeling this pure awareness? Sometimes, meditators report that the sense of I drops away. They don't feel like there's an observer anymore. There's just experience happening on its own. No one watching, just watching itself somehow. That leads to another layer of the paradox. If consciousness can exist without a separate I, then what does it mean to observe anything at all? You can see how slippery this gets. The more you try to pin down who the observer is, the more it slips out of reach. Like trying to bite your own teeth. You know something is happening. You know you are aware. But you can't fully step outside yourself to get a clear look at the process. You are both in it and trying to look at it at the same time. There's also the idea from philosophy that the self is not a thing but a process. You aren't a fixed self observing another fixed part of you. Instead, your sense of self is built from moment to moment as your brain and body take in new information, react to it, and reflect on it. If that's true, then when you observe yourself, you're just one part of the process looking at another part. Still the same process, just bending back on itself. Think about a camera pointed at a screen that shows what the camera sees. You get an image of an image of an image shrinking inward forever. Consciousness might do something like that. It loops, but each layer is still part of the same system. There's not a new person at each level. This can be unsettling. We like to think of ourselves as stable beings with clear boundaries. But the self-observer paradox shows us that our inner life is more flexible, more layered. You are not a single thing. You are a system that can look at itself, think about itself, and even change based on what it sees. That makes you both observer and observed at the same time. When you wake up in the morning, your sense of self feels whole. You open your eyes, and the world appears as one continuous experience. You may hear a bird, feel the weight of a blanket, and remember a dream, all at once. You don't stop to think, my hearing is doing this, my memory is doing that, and my sense of touch is adding this. It just feels like you. Everything seems to come together in one place, one point of awareness. But inside your brain, things look very different. The brain is not one single unit working as a team with perfect harmony. It's a messy, complex organ made of many different parts, each doing specific jobs. Some regions focus on sight, some on sound, some on movement, and some handle memory or emotion. These parts communicate, but they don't report to a central boss. No one part of the brain runs the whole show. Yet somehow, despite all this division, your experience feels unified. This is the unity paradox. Consciousness feels whole, but the brain is a system of many separate processes. How do we get the feeling of a single, seamless mind from so many disconnected parts? One way to understand this is to look at how different parts of the brain work together without merging into a single control center. For example, when you see a red apple, your brain doesn't just flip a single apple switch. One part of your brain processes the color red, another handles the round shape, another connects that visual data to the word apple, another adds the memory of what an apple tastes like. All these processes happen in different areas, but they come together so fast that you never notice any gap between them. You just see an apple. You can think of this like an orchestra. Each section, strings, brass, woodwinds, plays its own part. There's no sound if each plays alone, but when they play together, the music becomes one full piece. If you're sitting in the audience, you don't think about each section separately. You hear the whole sound. That's what your mind does. It doesn't split your experience into tiny pieces, it blends them into one stream. But even that analogy can be misleading, because an orchestra has a conductor. Your brain doesn't, at least not in the way we usually think. There's no part of your brain that stands outside the system and says, now let's blend all this together. The brain has no single place where it all comes together. Even the parts that deal with self-awareness and control, like the prefrontal cortex, only handle certain tasks. They're just another piece of the system. Yet the feeling of unity is very strong. If someone asks, "Who are you?" you don't say, "I'm a bundle of sight, sound, and touch modules that cooperate sometimes." You just say your name. You feel like one person, not a collection of systems. That's not just a belief, it's a direct feeling. One theory is that this unity is a product of timing. The brain works on a tight schedule. Signals from different parts of the brain reach each other in patterns that line up. If you see something and hear something at the same time, your brain syncs those events. That gives the impression that they're part of the same moment. But if the signals are even slightly off, your brain notices. You might feel that something is out of sync, like when a video and its sound don't match. So the sense of unity could be built on the brain's ability to time and sync information very fast. Another example comes from split brain research. When the connection between the two halves of the brain, the corpus callosum, is cut, usually to treat severe epilepsy, something strange happens. Each half of the brain keeps working, but they stop sharing information. In these patients, one hand might do something the other hand didn't intend. One side might see something and react, but the other side won't know why. Despite this, the person often still feels unified. They don't feel like two people. That shows how strong the brain's push toward unity is, even when its own systems are divided. This also shows that unity might not be built into the system. It might be a story the brain tells itself. When you act, your brain explains why you did it, even if the real reason came from a part of the brain you aren't aware of. Your brain fills in gaps, smooths over differences, and gives you a single narrative. That narrative feels like one continuous you, even though it's made from parts that often don't fully agree. Imagine watching a movie with some scenes cut out. If the editing is good, you don't notice. Your brain fills in the gaps. You still follow the story. In the same way, your brain edits your internal experience. It makes sure the parts fit, even if they come from different sources. It hides the seams. Neuroscientists use the term binding problem to talk about this issue. It asks how features like color, shape, motion, and sound, each handled by different neurons, come together in one coherent picture. No single cell or group of cells carries the full image. The brain binds those features using networks of neurons that fire together. Some suggest that this binding relies on rhythm. If the neurons for color and shape fire at the same time, the brain treats them as belonging to the same object. So unity could be a result of synchronized activity, not a central process, but a pattern of timing. Another important idea is global workspace theory. It suggests that many parts of the brain process information in parallel, but only some of it makes it into consciousness. Once a piece of information enters the global workspace, it becomes available to the whole system. Other parts can then act on it: memory, language, attention, planning. The workspace acts like a shared screen. Only one thing shows up at a time, but many systems can see it. That gives the feeling of unity. But again, the workspace is not a location. It's a function spread across many areas. You can also consider how attention works. You don't see everything at once. You focus. Your mind narrows to what matters in the moment. That focus makes the experience feel whole, because you're not dealing with all input at once. You're dealing with what fits your attention span. And that attention shifts smoothly. You don't usually notice when your brain drops some details and picks up others. It feels like one stream, even though it's really a series of selections. Think of how a flashlight works in a dark room. You only see what the beam touches. But as you move the light, you still feel like you're seeing the whole room, because your brain fills in the rest. That's how attention and memory combine to give you the sense of a whole experience, even when your brain processes only small parts at a time. So even though the brain is decentralized, no center, no boss, no full map, it still creates the experience of being one person. It does this through timing, rhythm, shared access to data, and clever editing. The unity of consciousness may not come from a single place. It may be something the brain builds on the fly, every moment, as it gathers, filters, and links information. And it does all this without letting you see the work behind the curtain. What you get is the polished final version, the sense that you are whole. You wake up one day and think, I am me. You have a name, a body, a history, a set of likes and dislikes. That sense of being a self is so familiar that it rarely gets questioned. But if you look closely, a strange question appears. Where did this self come from? If your consciousness creates your sense of self, then how did that self exist before it was created? If something builds the idea of you, then what was there before the building began? This is the self-creation paradox. The paradox starts with the idea that consciousness plays a key role in creating the self. Consciousness isn't just a light that shines on a ready-made you. It shapes, updates, and sometimes even reinvents who you are. But if consciousness builds the self, then who or what had the tools to begin the building? Who laid the first stone? You can look at it like trying to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. The phrase comes from the idea of lifting yourself off the ground by tugging on your shoes. It sounds clever, but doesn't work in practice. Something can't create itself from nothing. If the self is built by consciousness, then something had to exist to start the process. That leads to the question, did a basic version of you exist before you were conscious? Or did consciousness come first and make the self from scratch? To explore this, think about how a child becomes a person with a self. A newborn baby doesn't seem to have a clear sense of self. It cries when it's hungry or uncomfortable, but it doesn't know its own name. It doesn't know that its hands belong to it. It doesn't look in the mirror and say, "That's me." Over time, though, things change. The baby starts to notice patterns. It moves its arm and sees the fingers wiggle. It feels hunger and then remembers that food follows. It hears people say the same name over and over and begins to connect that sound to itself. Eventually, the child says, "me" or "mine." The self appears, but it doesn't appear all at once. The sense of self grows, and that growth depends on interaction. The child learns to see itself by noticing how others respond. The baby cries, the parent comes, the child points, someone looks. Slowly, a self-image forms, not just physically but mentally. The child starts to think in terms of what I want or what I did. Now consider what was there before the self developed. There was still a body, still a brain. There were reactions, impulses, sensations. But those things didn't yet form a unified self. There was activity, but not yet identity. That suggests that the raw materials for the self existed before the self as a concept came into being. So what built the self? It wasn't one event or one part of the brain. Instead, consciousness formed through layers. Awareness of the body, memory of past events, the ability to plan, the learning of language and feedback from others. Each layer added more structure to the idea of me. Still, the paradox remains. If the self is something that consciousness creates, then what decides what the self should be? What gives the initial push? There has to be something there before the self arrives. That something could be a basic form of awareness, what some call proto-consciousness. It's not a full self, but it knows sensation. It knows hunger, touch, heat, noise. This base layer may not be able to say I, but it still forms a center of experience. It's a point of view. From there, the more complex parts of self can grow. Think of a tree growing from a seed. The full tree doesn't exist in the beginning, but the seed contains the plan. The seed doesn't decide what kind of tree it wants to be. It just follows a process shaped by genetics, environment, and time. Maybe the self is like that. Consciousness doesn't invent the self from nothing. It starts from simple parts and then organizes them into something more complex. The you that appears later didn't exist in full at the start, but it grew from what was already present. Language plays a major role here. You can't think about yourself in a clear way without the ability to name it. Once you can use words like I, me, and mine, the self becomes easier to track. Language gives the mind the tools to tell stories about itself. Those stories become central to how you see yourself. But language doesn't create the raw sense of being alive or having a point of view. It shapes it, gives it structure, and allows it to grow into a personal narrative. Imagine a teenager going through a time of change. They might question who they are. They may try on new roles: athlete, artist, rebel. The self they present to others can change from one week to the next. But behind all those changes, there's still a thread of continuity. The person feels like the same me, even when their beliefs or style shift. That sense of self isn't fixed, but it's not empty either. It updates itself. Consciousness doesn't stop and rebuild from scratch every day. It modifies, adds, deletes, and shifts. In doing so, it gives the illusion of a stable self, even though the self is always in motion. Another example comes from adults who lose memory due to injury or illness. Some people with memory loss can still speak, walk, and act normally, but they don't remember key parts of their life. Their past has gaps, yet they still feel like a person. They may not recall who they were, but they still have a self in the present. That shows that memory supports the self, but is not the whole thing. The self continues as long as there is awareness, even if parts of the story go missing. This all suggests that the self isn't a single thing you either have or don't have. It's more like a system, a collection of habits, memories, feelings, and roles that are always shifting. Consciousness brings this system together and gives it shape. But it doesn't do so from zero. It uses what's already there: sensation, perception, emotion, reaction. So how can something create itself? It can't in a strict sense, but it can shape itself using existing parts. Consciousness doesn't invent the self from a blank slate. It gathers scattered elements and makes them into a pattern. That pattern becomes your idea of me. This process is gradual and ongoing. The self today is not the same self from 5 years ago. But it feels like it is because consciousness links each version into a continuous story. That story feels like it was always there. It wasn't. It was built piece by piece. And the builder, your conscious mind, used the raw material of a body, a brain, a world, and a history to do the job. You open your eyes and see light coming through a window. You hear a car outside. You feel the chair under you. It all seems straightforward. The world is out there, and you are in here, sensing it. But the only way you know the world is through your senses. Light hitting your eyes, sound reaching your ears, pressure on your skin. These sensations happen inside your body, not out in the world. You don't see the tree itself. You see light reflected from the tree, hitting your retina and getting processed by your brain. You don't hear the car engine directly. You feel air pressure changes turned into signals that travel through your nervous system. All of your knowledge of the world comes from within your own experience. That raises a strange problem. If everything you know about the outside comes from the inside, how can you be sure the outside world is really what you think it is? How can you say your mind depends on the external world if the only access you have to that world comes from within? This is the inside-out paradox. We say that the mind is a product of the world, that the brain depends on outside input, that our thoughts reflect what's out there. But we never experience the outside world directly. All we have are internal impressions. So how can something internal, something you never leave, point to something external, something you never reach? Start with a simple example. You look at a red apple. It seems like the redness is part of the apple. But color is not a property of objects in the strict physical sense. It's a result of how your brain interprets certain wavelengths of light. Different creatures see different colors based on how their eyes and brains are built. Bees can see ultraviolet light, which we can't. Some animals can't see red at all. So the redness you see lives inside your nervous system. The apple reflects light, but the red experience is in your mind. Still, you believe the apple is red. You treat your internal experience as if it maps the outside world, but you've never touched the world itself, only your image of it. Sound works the same way. When someone speaks to you, their voice pushes air molecules that hit your eardrum. Your brain turns those movements into language and meaning. You don't hear the air, you hear a person. You believe you're in touch with something outside, but again, you only feel what happens inside your own skull. Now think about touch. That seems like the most direct connection. When you put your hand on the table, you feel the hard surface push back, but you're not feeling the table itself. You're sensing how your skin responds to the pressure. Nerves send signals to the brain, and the brain creates a sense of contact. You assume the table exists, you treat it as solid and real, but you don't know the table. You know your experience of it. Even memory works this way. You remember a beach you visited as a child, but that memory is a mental image built from internal data. The original event is long gone. What's left is a trace in your mind. You may think the memory reflects something that really happened, and maybe it does. But the thing you have access to is not the beach. It's the memory, the internal image. From all these cases, a pattern emerges. The internal world is all we ever know. Yet we act as if it depends on something outside of us. That's the paradox. We treat our thoughts, feelings, and perceptions as signs of an external world, but we never get beyond the signs themselves. Philosophers have wrestled with this problem for a long time. Some have said that we can't really know if the outside world exists. All we can say is that experience happens. The world might be there, or it might not. We might be dreaming. We might be in a simulation. We might be brains in a tank, fed signals by a computer. We'd never know, because we can't step outside our own experience to check. But that doesn't mean the external world isn't real. It just means our link to it is always through internal states. So the idea that your mind depends on the world has to be restated. Your mind depends on the structure of experience that seems to be caused by the world, but it never touches the world itself. Imagine being inside a sealed submarine with no windows. You can hear the engine, feel the motion, maybe use sensors to measure water pressure. You build a picture of what's outside based on those signals. But you never leave the submarine. You never see the ocean directly. That's how your consciousness works. It's sealed inside your head. It builds a model of the world using signals, but it never escapes to check if the model matches the real thing. Still, the model works. You can walk across a room without bumping into furniture. You can catch a ball, drive a car, talk to someone, make plans. Your internal map of the external world is good enough to live by. That's part of why we trust it. It may not show the world as it truly is, but it shows it in a way that lets us act. The map may be drawn from the inside, but it still points to something stable enough to predict and respond to. There's also the feedback loop between internal and external. You act in the world, and the world pushes back. If you reach for a hot stove, you pull back fast. If you speak, someone replies. These effects make it hard to doubt that something is out there, but you still only know about it through changes in your own state. You feel the burn, hear the voice, see the reaction. Again, the loop goes from outside to inside, but you only know the inside. This makes it tempting to ask, could consciousness create the world instead of the other way around? Some thinkers have proposed that the mind shapes reality, not just receives it. In some views, the external world only exists as a set of patterns that make sense inside a mind. In others, the physical world is real, but incomplete without a conscious observer to make sense of it. These views push back against the idea that the world is primary and the mind just follows. They say the relationship might be more balanced or even reversed. You don't need to go that far to feel the force of the paradox. Even if you accept that the world exists, you can't avoid the fact that everything you know about it is filtered through a private internal lens. You are always inside looking out, never outside looking in. But you build your sense of reality from what appears on the inside. You live as if the outside causes the inside, even though you only ever see one side of the link. That's the twist. You believe your thoughts and sensations come from a world you never touch directly. You trust that your mind reflects something real beyond it, even though your only evidence is what happens within. You treat the external as solid and objective, but all you have are internal shadows and shapes. You navigate through them. You build a world out of them. And you rarely stop to ask how something so separate could feel so sure. You sit quietly and look at a candle. You see the flame move. You feel the warmth. You notice your thoughts come and go. These moments feel real in a way no physical description ever could. You don't just know the candle is burning, you experience it. You have the feeling of seeing. You have the awareness of your own thoughts. These are examples of subjective experience. They form the core of what we call consciousness. You are not just a collection of cells reacting to input. You are someone who feels what those reactions mean. But this leads to a puzzle. Science tells us that you are made of matter. Your brain is built from neurons. Neurons are made from molecules. Molecules are made from atoms. Nothing about these building blocks looks like consciousness. They follow physical laws. They don't see, hear, or feel. Yet when combined in the right way, they give rise to you, a conscious being. This idea is known as emergence. Consciousness, the argument goes, emerges from the activity of matter, specifically the matter inside the brain. This makes sense on the surface. A single water molecule is not wet, but many together create the property we call wetness. One ant is not a colony, but many ants following simple rules create complex behavior. In these cases, simple parts give rise to new properties when organized in the right way. These new properties are not found in the parts alone. They emerge from the system as a whole. People apply this thinking to the brain. Each neuron on its own is not conscious. It just fires or stays silent. But the brain contains billions of neurons, all wired together. They interact in patterns. The idea is that when enough of them work together in the right way, consciousness appears. In this view, subjective experience is an emergent feature of neural activity. But there's a problem. Even if you explain every part of the brain in detail, you still don't explain why it feels like something to be alive. Why do these physical patterns give rise to an inner life? Why isn't the brain just a machine that reacts without feeling? We don't ask this about computers. We don't think our phones suffer when they lose power, but we do feel pain, joy, fear, and wonder. We don't just process the world, we experience it. That's the hard part to explain. This is the emergence paradox. Consciousness is said to emerge from matter, but no description of matter seems to explain why experience happens at all. Subjective awareness doesn't seem to be made from smaller physical parts. It seems like something else entirely. And yet, it depends on the brain. If you change the brain, you change the mind. Damage one part, and memory can vanish. Stimulate another, and a person might feel a wave of fear. Consciousness and the brain are clearly linked, but the link itself feels like a mystery. Take vision as an example. Light enters the eyes, hits the retina, and turns into signals. These signals travel through the optic nerve and reach the visual cortex. There, neurons respond to shapes, motion, and color. We know a lot about how this process works, but nowhere in this chain do we find the actual experience of seeing. We can explain how the brain detects light, but we can't explain why detecting light creates the feeling of brightness or color. That experience is called a qualia, a raw piece of subjective experience. What does red feel like? What does pain feel like? These questions have no physical answers. They point to the irreducible part of consciousness. Imagine someone who has never seen color. You could show them a brain scan of someone looking at a red apple. You could explain every neuron involved, but none of that would tell them what red actually looks like. That's the gap between objective data and subjective experience. You can describe the system, but not the feeling. Some scientists argue that this gap will close as we learn more. They say the problem feels mysterious only because we don't have enough data. As brain science improves, we may find patterns that explain consciousness in the same way we explain digestion or electricity. But others believe the gap is deeper. They say subjective experience may never be reduced to physical terms. It may be a basic feature of the universe, like space, time, or gravity. There are other views as well. Some say we need to rethink what matter is. We tend to see matter as lifeless and unconscious. But what if that's the wrong starting point? What if all matter has some form of experience, even in a very simple way? This idea is called panpsychism. It says consciousness is not something that appears all at once, fully formed. Instead, it's a basic part of reality that gets more complex in higher forms of life. Under this view, consciousness doesn't emerge from matter. It builds up from simpler forms already present in matter. This would avoid the emergence paradox by saying experience never came from nowhere. It was always there, just in a different form. Another possibility is that our theories are too focused on the physical world and not enough on the structure of experience. Maybe we need a different kind of science, one that combines physical data with first-person reports. Instead of trying to explain consciousness from the outside, we might need to explore it from the inside. This approach would ask, what are the patterns in experience itself? Can we describe how thoughts and feelings relate to each other without reducing them to physical causes? This would not solve the paradox, but it might offer a new way to map the mind. Think about music. You can describe it as vibrations in the air. You can measure its frequency and volume. But the beauty of a song doesn't come from those numbers. It comes from the way it makes you feel. That feeling is real, even if you can't find it in the sound waves. Consciousness may be the same. It has a structure and a logic, but not one we can see by breaking it into parts. This is what makes the emergence paradox so challenging. Consciousness is clearly tied to the brain, but it also feels like something more. It has a quality that matter alone does not explain. We don't know if this means our science is missing something, or if we are asking the wrong kinds of questions. What we do know is that experience is real. and it matters. You know what it's like to be you. That alone makes consciousness unlike anything else we've tried to explain. You know what it's like to feel pain. You know what it's like to be happy, to remember something, to daydream. These are all parts of your conscious experience. You don't need anyone to explain them to you because you live them. But what about the person next to you? They smile, speak, and act like they feel things too. They wince when they're hurt, laugh at jokes, and tell stories. It seems obvious they're conscious, yet you can't feel their pain or joy. You only see behavior. You never get direct access to what it's like to be them. This is the Inaccessibility Paradox. You know your own consciousness firsthand, but you can't reach into someone else's mind. You can't see the world through their eyes, hear thoughts inside their head, or share their inner life. Everything about another person's consciousness must be guessed based on what they say and do. If consciousness is private like this, how can you be sure other people are even conscious? It sounds like a strange question. Of course, other people are conscious, you might think. But if you slow down and look carefully, the logic becomes tricky. You assume other people have experiences like you do. But you can't test this directly. You can test how their body reacts, you can check their heart rate, brain activity, or reflexes. But none of that shows you their actual experience. You see the signals, not the feeling behind them. Think of someone in a coma. Their body might still function. Machines may keep them breathing. Their brain may even show signs of activity. But you can't know if they're still in there. Are they dreaming? Are they aware? You can't tell. You look for clues, but you never get direct proof. Or take someone who is very good at pretending. Maybe they act like they feel pain, but really don't. Or maybe they smile while hiding deep sadness. The inside doesn't always match the outside. That's why the gap between behavior and experience matters. We deal with this gap all the time. When a friend tells you they're upset, you believe them. You don't ask to see their feelings. You trust their words. But what gives you that trust? It's not proof. It's based on your own experience. You know what it's like to feel things, and you assume others do too. That's the key. You project your own experience onto others. You don't know what it's like to be them, but you imagine it based on what it's like to be you. This way of thinking works most of the time. If someone cuts their finger and yells, you don't wonder if they feel pain. You assume they do because you would. But this is still an assumption. Philosophers call this the problem of other minds. You only know your own mind. You guess that others have minds like yours, but you can't be sure. It's like watching a puppet show. The puppets move and talk. They seem alive, but you know they're not. They're controlled from behind the scenes. The people around you aren't puppets, but from the outside, they could be. You don't see their thoughts. You see the show. This is more than a thought experiment. In the real world, it affects how we treat others. If you believe someone is conscious, you care about their experience. You try not to hurt them. You take their words seriously. But what if you doubt their consciousness? That doubt can lead to distance, mistrust, or worse. That's why the question matters, not just in theory, but in how we live. You can look at this in terms of machines. Think about an AI chatbot. It answers questions, tells jokes, even says, "I understand." But does it really understand? Or is it just producing words based on patterns? If it says, "I feel sad," does that mean anything? Most people would say no. The machine doesn't have an inner life. It doesn't feel anything. It just simulates. Now compare that to a person who says the same thing. You believe the person means it. Why? Because they're human? Because they look like you? Because you felt sad too? This brings up the issue of appearance. We trust people are conscious because they look and act the part. We apply this rule to animals too. You might assume a dog feels pain when it whines, but you're less sure about a fish or an insect. The more something behaves like us, the more we assume it has consciousness. But that's not proof, it's pattern matching. It's a shortcut. Some scientists try to get around this by looking at brain function. If someone's brain works like yours, maybe their experience is similar. But this still doesn't open the door. You see activity. You don't see the experience itself. It's like watching smoke and guessing about fire. The smoke tells you something is happening, but it doesn't show you the flame. There are rare cases that make this even harder. Some people with locked-in syndrome are fully aware but unable to move or speak. From the outside, they may seem unconscious, but inside, they're still there. In other cases, people might show behavior but lack awareness, like sleepwalkers or patients under certain forms of anesthesia. These cases blur the line. They show that behavior doesn't always match experience. So how do we live with this paradox? We rely on inference. We assume that if someone talks, moves, and responds like we do, they probably have an inner life. This assumption is not provable. It's practical. It helps us relate, cooperate, and care. But it leaves the core question unanswered. Are others truly conscious, or do they just act like they are? You can imagine an extreme view, solipsism. This is the belief that only your mind exists. Everything else, people, the world, even time, could be a projection. It sounds strange, but you can't disprove it. You only know what's in your awareness. Everything else is secondhand. Still, most people reject solipsism. They find it lonely or unhelpful or just too far from daily life. But it shows how deep the inaccessibility paradox runs. We take comfort in shared experience. When someone says, "I know how that feels," it builds a bridge. But that bridge is built on trust, not access. You never walk into someone else's mind. You only meet them at the edge of behavior, at words, gestures, and reactions. That's as close as you get. And yet, we build whole relationships, communities, and cultures on that thin connection. We act as if others are conscious, even though we never see their consciousness directly. The paradox remains. We live in a world full of people we never truly reach. We see their faces, hear their voices, and share their space. But their minds stay hidden. We believe they're like us, and that belief holds our lives together. But beneath that belief is a question we can't answer, no matter how clearly we ask it. You sit across from a friend and tell them about your day. You say you felt tired, frustrated, and then relieved when a problem got solved. They nod and say they understand. Maybe they share a similar story. You feel like you've connected, like they got what you meant. But if you stop and think, there's a strange fact underneath that moment. They didn't feel your frustration. They didn't live your relief. They didn't experience your day. All they got were your words. They heard the sound of your voice, saw your expression, and filled in the rest with guesses based on their own past. Yet the whole exchange felt like shared understanding. This is the privacy paradox. Your conscious experience is private. No one but you sees what you see, hears what you hear, or feels what you feel in the way you do. But we talk to each other as if we understand exactly what others mean. We use language to bridge the gap between minds, and for the most part, it works. But the bridge is only partial. It's never total. You can't actually step into someone else's experience. You just act as if you can. You can test this easily. Close your eyes and think about the color red. Try to picture it clearly. You see a certain shade, maybe the red of a fire truck or a ripe tomato. Now ask yourself, does anyone else see that red in the same way you do? You can't know. You assume the red they see is like yours because you both use the same word. But their internal image might be different. It might be darker, lighter, more vivid, or less so. The word is shared. The experience is not. Language gives the illusion of shared experience. When someone says, "I'm sad," you think you understand. But sadness doesn't look or feel the same in every person. One person might cry, another might go silent, one might feel hollow, another might feel heavy. When we hear the word, we map it onto our own past, our own version of sadness, and act as if we now know what the speaker feels. But we don't. We only know what those words would mean if we said them. We fill in the blanks with our own history. This is what makes the privacy of consciousness such a strange thing. It's total. We never share direct access to what we think or feel, but also routinely ignored. If someone says, "I have a headache," we nod, we believe them, and maybe we offer help. But we don't pause to ask whether their headache feels sharp, dull, or pressure-like. We don't wonder if their pain is like our pain. We assume enough similarity to keep the conversation going. That assumption is useful. Without it, we couldn't function. Imagine if every sentence had to come with a detailed explanation of what each word feels like inside the speaker's mind. Communication would break down, so we take shortcuts. We agree on basic meanings and move fast. The phrase, "I feel anxious," covers a wide range of inner states. But it works because the listener, doesn't need to know the exact shape of the anxiety. They just need to know enough to respond. But the shortcut hides the real gap. You never get the full picture of what someone else is feeling. You get hints. Tone, body language, and words all help. Still, you are building your version of their experience based on your own mind. You are translating, not receiving. That translation might be close, or it might miss the mark completely. Think about a therapist listening to a client. The client describes a recent loss, a breakup, a death, a missed chance. The therapist listens closely, reflects what they hear, maybe asks questions. A good therapist builds trust by showing that they care and that they're trying to understand. But even the best therapist doesn't feel the client's pain directly. They bring their own experience of loss to the session and use it to imagine what the client might be feeling. The better the match between their imagined version and the client's reality, the stronger the sense of connection. But there's always a gap. The connection is real. The access is still limited. You can also see the limits of shared understanding when it fails. A couple argues, not because they disagree on facts, but because they feel misunderstood. One says, "I'm not mad, I'm hurt." The other says, "You're always mad." Each person is stuck in their own perspective. The words they use don't match the inner state they're trying to explain, or the listener hears something different from what was meant. The conversation becomes two monologues. The bridge breaks. This happens not just in close relationships, but in society as a whole. When people talk about large, shared problems like injustice, trauma, or identity, they use emotional language, but others may not connect. They might hear the words but not grasp the depth. They might doubt the speaker's sincerity because they can't feel what the speaker feels. That's not because they're cold or dishonest. It's because they can't access the inner world behind the words. They only see the surface. The privacy of experience makes shared understanding fragile, even when everyone is trying. This privacy shows up even more clearly when we try to describe something entirely internal. Imagine trying to explain what it feels like to be you, to be aware, to think in words, to have memories rise and fall, to feel your own presence. There's no way to explain it in a way that gives another person the actual experience. You can describe features. You can say, "It's like there's a voice in my head," or "It's like watching my thoughts from a distance." But no matter how carefully you explain, they don't get the experience itself. They only get a sketch. Think of it like describing music to someone who can't hear. You can talk about rhythm and melody, you can compare it to vibrations or movement, but you can't give them the actual sound. You can only describe what it's like for you. Consciousness is like that. It's music heard from the inside. You can describe it, but you can't share it. Still, we treat consciousness as if it can be shared. We write books, make art, record stories, and speak in public. These are all acts of trying to transmit inner life. And they often succeed, at least enough to build culture, trust, and meaning. A poem doesn't transfer an experience, but it echoes one. A song doesn't give you someone else's emotion, but it helps you feel something that might match. This partial sharing is often enough to bring people together. The privacy paradox isn't a failure of language. It's a feature of consciousness. It shows us the limits of what can be known from the outside, but it also points to the effort we make to cross those limits. We talk, write, perform, and listen, not because we can fully share our experience, but because we want to get as close as we can. Even knowing that perfect understanding isn't possible, we try. The paradox is that our minds are private, and yet we live as if they can be shared. And somehow, even without full access, the act of trying still connects us. You open your eyes and the world appears. Light, shapes, colors, maybe sounds. Thoughts start moving. You feel something. Maybe it's hunger, calm, or discomfort. You might not know where you are, what day it is, or even who you are, at least not right away. But one thing is clear. You are having an experience. You are conscious. You can question a lot of things. You can wonder if you're dreaming, if your memories are wrong, or if the world around you is fake. Maybe you're in a simulation. Maybe everything you believe is a mistake. But one thing you can't honestly doubt is that something is happening inside your mind. Even if the content of your thoughts is wrong, the fact that there are thoughts is certain. That's the core of the certainty paradox. The paradox works like this. The one thing you can be absolutely sure of is that you are conscious. That doesn't mean you know how it works, what it's made of, or even who you are. But you do know that you are experiencing. There is awareness. There is something it's like to be you right now reading this. You don't need evidence. You don't need to test it. You don't need a second opinion. It's immediate and direct. But at the same time, you cannot prove your consciousness to anyone else. You can talk about it. You can describe what you see or feel. You can say, I'm aware, I'm thinking, or I exist. But those are just words. Another person hears them, but they don't get access to your experience. They don't feel what you feel. They can only observe your behavior and listen to your claims. You might say, of course I'm conscious, but so could a machine programmed to say the same thing. That's the first layer of the paradox. Consciousness is the one thing you can't doubt, and also the one thing you can't show to anyone else. You live with certainty, but you can't transfer it. You know, but no one else can verify it. That puts consciousness in a strange category, more real to you than anything, and yet invisible to the outside world. The philosopher René Descartes captured this with the phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. He didn't mean I exist as a body, or I exist in space. He meant that the very act of thinking proves that there is something or someone doing the thinking. Even if all else is false, even if a demon is tricking you, you still must be conscious to be fooled. You can't be tricked without a mind. So the one thing you can't lose is the awareness itself. But Descartes' insight didn't solve the problem of proving consciousness to others. You might be sure you're conscious, but how can you be sure that anyone else is? You assume they are. You see them move, talk, react. You assume they feel pain when they're hurt or joy when they laugh. But you don't know it the way you know your own mind. You infer it. You make a best guess. Take a thought experiment. Imagine a world where everyone behaves exactly like a conscious person, but has no inner experience. They smile, speak, cry, and act like they feel, but inside there's nothing, no awareness. These are philosophical zombies, or P-zombies. They act just like you, but they are empty inside. There's no way to tell the difference from the outside. That's because consciousness leaves no physical trace. It doesn't light up on a screen. It doesn't produce a number. It only shows itself to the person who has it. Now think about a person in a hospital bed, fully paralyzed but aware. Their brain can't send signals to move or speak. From the outside, they might seem unconscious, but inside they're still there, watching, listening, thinking. Without some way to communicate, no one would ever know. That's not just an idea. It happens. Some patients with locked-in syndrome live in that state for years. Consciousness, in those cases, is completely private. All you can do is take their word for it, if they ever regain a way to speak. You can try to imagine what it would take to prove consciousness. Maybe brain scans, but a scan shows activity, not experience. You might find patterns that often occur when people are awake and aware. But that's not the same as seeing consciousness. A sleeping brain might look active too. A computer could show similar patterns one day. Would that mean it's conscious? Or just mimicking the look? Let's say you meet someone who says, I'm conscious. You believe them. But what makes you believe it? Their behavior, their background, their similarity to you? You're using cues, not proof. It feels enough, but again, it's not like knowing your own mind. You don't feel their consciousness the way you feel your own. That puts each person in a strange position. You walk through the world with total certainty about your inner life and total uncertainty about everyone else's. You feel pain, joy, love, confusion, and you know these are real. But when you look at others, you can only guess. You may trust, you may empathize, you may feel connected, but you can't verify. This gap shows up in ordinary life. When someone says, you don't understand how I feel, they're pointing at this wall. You might try, you might imagine, but you can't step inside their experience. You can only match it to something in your own past and compare. You make your best effort, but the final leap is always a guess. That's why deep connection feels so rare. It's not just about listening. It's about trying to bridge something that can't fully be bridged. The certainty paradox doesn't just apply to people. It applies to machines too. As artificial intelligence improves, we may build systems that talk like us, answer questions, maybe even say, I'm conscious. But what would convince you that it's true? If it says, I feel afraid, is it really afraid? Or just following code? You can't tell. You can only guess, just like with people. The difference is that with people, you assume consciousness because they are made like you. Machines are not. So even if a machine acts conscious, the certainty isn't there. That reveals something important. You don't just know you're conscious. You are conscious. The knowing and the being are the same. You don't step outside to look at it. You don't measure it. You live it. That makes it different from every other fact. You can learn about the moon, the ocean, or electricity. You can measure those things. You can test them. But consciousness doesn't show up in data. It doesn't need evidence. It is the evidence for itself and only to itself. This is the root of the paradox. Consciousness is the one thing you can't doubt and the one thing you can't share. You carry it with you everywhere. It shapes every experience. It's more certain than any belief, but no one else can touch it. You can say, I know I'm conscious, and be completely right, but you can't make anyone else feel what you feel, not exactly. They can listen, believe, and relate. But the proof you have is proof only for you. You sit down and decide to think about your own mind. You're not thinking about a book, a memory, or a friend. You're thinking about thinking. This might seem normal. People reflect all the time. You might ask, why did I say that? Or what am I really feeling? But when you try to understand consciousness itself, something odd happens. You're using the mind to examine the mind. Your awareness becomes both the tool and the target. That creates a loop, and in that loop is a deep problem. This is the knowledge limitation paradox. It asks whether a conscious mind can fully understand consciousness, given that it is both the observer and the observed. The problem is not just about difficulty, it's about limits. Can a system explain itself completely from within? Imagine a camera trying to take a photo of itself, not its reflection, not its shadow, but itself directly. It can't. A part of it will always be out of frame. Something will always stay unseen. You can take the same idea and apply it to the mind. When you look at your own experience, you're always looking from the inside. You never step outside your awareness to see it from a distance. You can describe what it's like to think, to feel, or to notice. But the very act of describing uses the thing you're trying to explain. That creates a limit. You can measure your heartbeat. You can see your hand. You can even scan your brain. But you can't step outside your own consciousness to observe it as a whole. You're always in the middle of it. This is like trying to see your own eye without a mirror, or trying to jump over your own shadow. No matter what you do, part of you is always doing the looking. The mind can reflect on itself, but it can't fully catch itself. You can test this in real time. Try to become fully aware of your awareness. Not your thoughts, not your breath, not your surroundings, just the awareness itself. You might get a brief sense of it, a feeling of presence. But the moment you think, there it is, you've already shifted the focus. You've created a thought about awareness, not awareness itself. The mind steps back, creates a concept, and loses the direct contact. That's the loop again. You're always one step behind. Science runs into this problem too. Neuroscience can measure brain activity. It can link patterns in the brain to reports of experience. But those reports are still secondhand. They don't show consciousness itself. They show data about consciousness, timing, location, intensity. You can see when a subject reports seeing red, you can watch the brain regions involved. But you can't find the red itself inside the brain. You find activity, not the experience. This isn't a failure of science. It's a built-in feature of the problem. Consciousness is not just something the brain does. It's what allows anything to be known in the first place. You don't just have thoughts, you know you have them. That knowing is what we call awareness. And awareness doesn't stand outside the system. It is the system. You might compare this to trying to read a book with the pages glued to your face. You can read the words right in front of you, but you can't see the whole structure. You don't get the shape of the story. You only get what your position allows. The conscious mind may be in the same position. You get pieces of the picture, but you never get the full view. Some thinkers say this means consciousness can't be fully explained by the mind that holds it. It would be like asking a flashlight to shine on itself. You can move it around, you can point it at mirrors, but it never lights up its own source. The tool you need is the tool you're trying to analyze. That creates a ceiling for understanding. Others argue that we can still make progress, just not total knowledge. You might not understand your mind perfectly, but you can understand parts of it well enough to function. You can study memory, emotion, attention. You can learn what helps or harms focus. You can even learn patterns about how people become aware of things. But each of those insights stays within the system. You're not outside looking in. You're inside, describing your position. Think of it like trying to map a forest while standing in it. You can measure the trees, mark the trails, and guess the edges, but you never see the whole shape from above. You act based on the map you've made, even if it's not perfect. The same might be true for consciousness. We can model parts of it. We can describe how it behaves, but we don't get to see the entire terrain. Language adds another layer. When we talk about consciousness, we use words, but words are part of the mind. They don't float above it. They are tools built by consciousness to talk about itself. So even our best theories are limited by the structure of the very thing we're trying to explain. We name the parts, but the naming never captures the full thing. You can also compare this to self-diagnosis. A doctor might spot signs in a patient that the patient doesn't see. But what happens when the doctor tries to diagnose herself? She might miss details. She might be too close to the issue. The same applies to the mind. When it tries to see itself, it may miss what an outside view could show, if such a view were even possible. There are moments when the mind seems to glimpse itself more clearly. Some people describe this happening during meditation. They say they become aware of awareness itself. They don't think about it, they just rest in it. But even these reports are temporary, and once described, they become memories or concepts. The direct moment fades. The mind talks about it, but doesn't stay in it. This suggests that full knowledge of consciousness from within might always fall short. Not because we're lazy or not smart enough, but because of the structure of the thing we're trying to know. Consciousness is not just another object, it's what makes knowing possible in the first place. That puts it in a different category. You don't see it the way you see a tree or a tool. You live inside it. You use it to see everything else. This doesn't make consciousness mystical or unreachable. It makes it subtle. You can work with it, study it, refine your understanding, but you may never get the final answer. Not because the answer doesn't exist, but because the question turns back on itself. It asks something that no perspective inside the system can fully resolve. You can't get outside your own awareness to look at it from a distance. You can't pin it down like a butterfly in a case. You live it, you shape it, and then you ask it to explain itself. That's the loop. That's the paradox. You are the subject asking about the subject, the tool trying to describe its own grip, the light trying to see its own source. You sit down and decide to examine your own mind. You want to know what consciousness really is, not just the word, but the thing itself. You close your eyes and begin to focus. At first, you notice your thoughts. Maybe you think about what you had for breakfast or a conversation from earlier. Then you notice your body, your breath, the weight of your arms, a dull ache in your back. You try to move past all that. You want to find the thing behind the thoughts. You want to find pure awareness. But as soon as you notice one part of your experience, it shifts. You try to look directly at consciousness, but it keeps turning into something else. A thought, a feeling, an image. You try again. Maybe you try to sit perfectly still and wait. Still, what you find are contents of consciousness, not consciousness itself. The more carefully you look, the harder it becomes to find exactly what you're looking for. This is the introspection paradox. The more you analyze consciousness, the more it escapes precise definition. You try to pin it down, and it moves. You try to observe it directly, and it changes form. It stays just outside your grip, even though you use it to make the attempt. You are the observer and the observed. You are the thing trying to describe itself. This isn't a casual frustration. It shows up across many disciplines. In psychology, researchers try to map mental states by asking people to describe their thoughts and feelings. But the act of describing those thoughts can change them. If you ask someone, "Are you anxious?" they might stop and think, "Am I?" That thought brings up more thoughts. The answer becomes shaped by the question, And once something is named, it stops being raw experience and becomes a concept. I feel uneasy turns into I have anxiety, which turns into a story about the self. The direct experience is already gone, replaced by a label. In philosophy, the problem goes deeper. You can list qualities of consciousness. It's continuous, it has intentionality, it feels like something. But those qualities describe what consciousness does, not what it is. Try to define it, and your definitions circle around the real thing. You say it's awareness. You say it's the capacity for experience. You say it's the space in which thoughts occur. These phrases point to something, but they never fully capture it. The closer you look, the more it slips away. You can test this by trying to write a single sentence that defines consciousness in a way that includes everything essential and leaves out everything extra. It's difficult. Most definitions end up vague, like the state of being aware, or too narrow, like brain activity that enables subjective experience. Each version tries to capture the whole, but ends up describing only a part. The problem isn't just the complexity of the subject, it's the way the subject changes as you examine it. Think of trying to catch a shadow. You chase it, and it moves with you. You adjust your angle, and it adjusts too. You can see it clearly, but you can't hold it. Consciousness works in a similar way. You live inside it, you use it every moment, but as soon as you try to turn around and grab it, it shifts. Part of the issue is that introspection adds a layer. You have a thought, and then you think about that thought. You try to watch yourself thinking. Now you're not just experiencing, you're observing the experience. That split creates distance. It turns a live moment into a subject for study. And once you're studying it, you're no longer in it the same way. You've changed your stance. Instead of being, you're analyzing being. This happens in meditation too. Some people practice observing their own awareness. The goal is often to rest in pure presence, not in thoughts, not in feelings, but in the raw field of awareness itself. But even in those moments, the same issue can arise. If you sit and think, now I'm aware, that thought pulls you out of the direct experience. You're thinking about awareness, not being aware. That shift is subtle but important. It shows how easily introspection turns into abstraction. Now consider how this plays out in everyday life. You might be walking through a forest and suddenly feel peaceful. You don't analyze it, you just feel it. Then you stop and think, I feel peaceful. That moment changes. You start to watch yourself being peaceful. The feeling might stay or it might fade. The direct experience has now become something you're thinking about. The focus has shifted from presence to commentary. That's not always bad, but it's a change in kind. You've moved from living to analyzing. That shift is at the heart of the introspection paradox. You want to understand your own awareness, but the tools you use are part of the system you're trying to explain. You can never fully get outside it. You're trying to understand fire by lighting more fire. You use thoughts to study thoughts. You use attention to study attention. And each step adds a layer between you and the thing you're trying to find. This doesn't mean introspection is useless. It can help you notice patterns in your thinking. It can help you see how your mind reacts to fear, desire, boredom, or pressure. It can help you catch habits before they take over. But when it comes to defining consciousness itself, introspection reaches its limits. You can describe parts, you can name functions, but the core, the fact that there is something it's like to be you, never gets fully captured. There's a parallel here with trying to define love or beauty or the taste of salt. You can talk around the experience. You can describe when it happens, what it's like, what causes it. But the actual experience resists translation. You either know it or you don't. You feel it or you don't. Consciousness is like that, but deeper. It's the background of all experiences. It's not one event among many. It's what makes events possible in the first place. Science can describe the structure of the brain. It can map neural networks, identify regions involved in vision, memory, emotion. It can track activity down to individual cells. But even the most detailed map doesn't show the feeling of seeing red, or the sense of self, or the pull of a memory. Those are experiences. And the experience itself is what introspection tries to grasp. The paradox lies in this. The more you try to look at the source, the more you create distance from it. The more you turn experience into an object of thought, the more you lose the direct sense of it. The act of examining changes the thing being examined. You can circle the center, describe the edges, point in its direction, but the center always stays just out of reach. You open your eyes in the morning. You feel the bed beneath you. You hear a dog bark outside. Light filters through the window. A thought comes to mind. You have a meeting today. These moments blend smoothly. One leads to the next. There's no gap. It feels like a flow, what William James called the stream of consciousness. Your awareness moves from one thing to another without breaks. It seems continuous, like a river, always moving forward, always connected. But your brain doesn't work that way. Brain activity happens in bursts. Neurons fire or stay silent. Electrical signals pass in spikes, not smooth lines. Even your senses work in steps. Your eyes move several times a second in quick jumps called saccades. Your brain fills in the gaps. You don't notice the jumps, but they're there. Auditory processing also works in short windows. The brain collects sound in chunks before turning it into meaning. Your thoughts, memories, and attention all shift in short bursts of activity. Brain scans show this clearly. Different parts of the brain activate and then go quiet. Patterns rise and fall in rapid cycles. This is the stream paradox. Consciousness feels like a smooth, unbroken flow, but the brain that supports it runs in fragments. How do these momentary bursts add up to a continuous experience? How can a stream arise from steps? One way to understand this is by looking at perception. When you watch a movie, you see motion. But the film is actually a series of still images. Each frame flashes on the screen for a fraction of a second. Your brain connects them, fills in the in-between, and creates the illusion of motion. You don't see the frames, you see the story. The projector clicks forward in steps, but your mind smooths it into a flow. Your brain does something similar all the time. It takes snapshots, brief pulses of sensory and internal data, and links them together. Each burst on its own is incomplete, but when placed side by side, they form a continuous pattern. This happens so quickly that you never notice the stitching. You live in the result, not the process. Think about hearing a melody. If someone plays one note and then another a second later, you hear two separate tones. But if the notes come fast enough, your brain groups them into a tune. The space between notes disappears. The melody becomes a single shape in your mind. Each sound is discrete, but the pattern feels continuous. Attention works the same way. You don't pay attention to everything all at once. You shift focus. You zoom in on one thing, then move to another. These shifts happen in brief cycles. Some researchers think the brain samples the world in small windows, maybe every few hundred milliseconds. But the brain knits those samples into a seamless experience. You don't feel the pauses. You feel presence. You feel flow. Even decision-making happens in steps. When you choose what to eat, your brain weighs options, filters memories, and monitors hunger. These processes happen in networks that activate and pause. You don't notice the individual pulses. You just feel yourself wanting one thing more than another. The outcome feels like a single thought, but underneath, it's the sum of many fragments. You can see how this works in memory, too. Try to recall your walk to work yesterday. You don't remember every step. You recall certain pieces. A red car at the light, the sound of birds, the way the air felt. Your memory isn't continuous. It's a patchwork. But your brain organizes those pieces into a coherent path. The story makes sense. The gaps disappear. You remember the walk as a smooth event, even though it was built from scattered parts. Now look at how the brain handles vision. You're never looking at the entire scene at once. Your eyes focus on one area at a time. The rest of the visual field is less detailed. But your brain fills in the gaps. It creates a stable image. If you move your eyes quickly across a room, the scene doesn't jump. It flows. The brain updates your position, smooths the transitions, and gives you a sense of motion through space. That's not how the data comes in. The data is jagged. The result is smooth. Why does it feel smooth? One answer is that the brain uses prediction. It doesn't just process the present. It also guesses what should come next. These predictions help smooth over the gaps between sensory pulses. If something unexpected happens, like a loud crash, your attention snaps to it. Your brain updates the model. But most of the time, things unfold as expected, and the sense of continuity remains. This predictive model runs fast. When you walk, You don't consciously think about every step. Your brain runs a script that predicts how your foot will land. If the ground shifts, you feel it. The prediction failed. Now you notice the difference. But when things go as expected, you don't think about them. The prediction becomes your experience. And because it's always one step ahead, it feels like a flow. The stream of consciousness, then, may be a kind of illusion, a useful one. Your brain turns scattered events into a single timeline. It edits out the noise. It fills in blanks. It builds a story from slices. The slices come quickly, so the story feels solid. But if you slow down, you might catch the pieces. You might notice the gaps. Some people do. In certain meditative states, people report a different sense of time. They describe thoughts appearing as distinct events. The stream becomes a series of drops. Each moment stands on its own. This suggests that the stream is not built in, it's constructed. And under some conditions, the construction can break down or shift. Other people notice this during fatigue or illness. You might feel disconnected. Time feels broken. You move through the day in fragments. You forget why you walked into a room. Your thoughts jump. In these moments, the smooth story of the self feels less stable. You don't feel like a stream. You feel like a set of pieces trying to stay linked. So what keeps the stream going under normal conditions? The answer may lie in integration. The brain has systems that link information across time. The prefrontal cortex helps track plans and goals. The default mode network supports a sense of self that stretches across moments. These systems don't just process information, they connect it. They form a thread. That thread becomes the stream. You live on that thread. You feel the world as one moment sliding into the next. But the pieces that make it happen, the neuron spikes, the sensory samples, the brief bursts of attention, come in fragments. Your mind doesn't show you the pieces. It shows you the path. That's the paradox. The stream of consciousness feels like a smooth river, but it's made from drops. Your brain builds the flow from fragments, and you live in the flow. You live in the story that those fragments make. You wake up and know who you are. You remember your name, your job, the layout of your home. You remember that you like coffee in the morning and that you have a meeting later. You don't have to rebuild your identity from scratch every day. It feels like your life continues, like there's a stable thread running from the past into the present. That thread is memory. Consciousness depends on this thread. If you couldn't remember what just happened, you wouldn't feel like the same person from one moment to the next. Your sense of being you would break apart. You'd be lost in the present with no context. Memory provides that context. It allows your awareness to stretch across time. Without it, there is no story, just scattered scenes with no order. But memory is not a perfect record. It isn't a video camera. It doesn't store exact footage of events. Every time you remember something, you rebuild it. You reconstruct the past based on fragments, some true, some guessed, some influenced by what you've learned since. Memory is fluid. It shifts, it edits, it leaves things out, it adds new elements. The same memory can feel solid one day and vague the next. You might remember a conversation with confidence, only to later find out it never happened that way. This is the memory loop paradox. Your sense of self and continuity relies on memory, but memory is unstable. You use an unreliable system to build a stable identity. You can see this paradox clearly in simple situations. Think about a time when you told a story from your childhood. You remember riding a bike, falling, and getting back up. You tell the story a few times over the years. With each retelling, you might change small details. Maybe the color of the bike shifts from red to blue. Maybe your father, not your brother, was there. You don't notice the changes because the story still feels true. But slowly, the version you tell becomes more polished than accurate. It fits your identity. It becomes part of your personal narrative, even if parts of it are wrong. This happens not just with stories, but with daily experience. You might walk into a room and forget why. A few minutes later, you remember. But what you remember may not be the exact thought that first sent you there. Your brain fills in the gap with a likely reason. It patches the story, so it makes sense. You feel like you've remembered something, but in some cases, you've only created a plausible explanation. Memory also works in layers. Short-term memory holds information for seconds or minutes. Long-term memory stores patterns, facts, and stories. Working memory helps you hold and use what's in your mind right now. Each of these systems contributes to consciousness. Without working memory, your thoughts would scatter too fast to follow. Without long-term memory, you'd have no idea who you are. But each system is vulnerable to error. Distractions, stress, fatigue, and emotion all shape what gets remembered and how. Neuroscience shows how memory reconstruction happens. When you recall something, your brain reactivates networks related to that event. But it also pulls in other material, related images, current beliefs, emotional states. This blend can change the original memory. The act of remembering is also the act of rewriting. And once the memory is rewritten, the new version gets stored in place of the old one. You don't just retrieve the past, you revise it. This process is efficient. It allows the brain to adapt and simplify, but it also introduces distortion. False memories are common. You might think you remember meeting someone when what you recall is actually a photo of that meeting. You might swear you said something out loud when in fact you only thought about saying it. These errors don't feel like guesses, they feel like facts. Your brain makes no announcement when it alters a memory. It just gives you the new version. So now the loop becomes clear. Consciousness relies on memory to feel continuous. You think, I am the same person I was yesterday. But the record you use to support that thought has been updated without your knowledge. You believe in a stable self, but the material that forms it is fluid. You tell yourself a story based on memory, and that story shapes your current identity. Then, from that identity, you remember past events in a way that fits. This loop reinforces itself. You are shaped by what you remember, and you remember in ways that support who you think you are. Imagine someone who believes they've always been brave. They remember times they stood up to bullies, spoke their mind, or acted without fear. But when they're shown an old diary that tells a different story, one of hesitation and fear, they might say, "That doesn't sound like me." They've edited the past to match the present. That doesn't mean they're lying. It means memory is selective. The loop between who you are and what you remember feeds itself. Now think about cases where memory breaks down. In amnesia, people lose access to large parts of their past. They may still speak, walk, and react to the world, but they no longer feel like the same person. Without the timeline of memory, identity fragments. You can also see this in Alzheimer's disease. As memory fades, the sense of self changes. Loved ones become strangers. The patient might ask the same question again and again, unaware they just asked it. Consciousness becomes stuck in short loops. The story no longer moves forward. Continuity breaks. Even healthy memory changes over time. Childhood memories become blurred, some vanish, others stay sharp for no clear reason. You might remember your third-grade teacher's face, but not the names of people you met last week. The brain doesn't keep everything. It keeps what feels useful, emotional, or repeated. The rest gets lost or overwritten. Yet you still wake up and feel like the same person. The illusion of continuity holds, even as the material behind it shifts. This raises a deeper question. If the content of memory changes, but the sense of being you remains, what is that sense based on? Maybe it's not a specific memory, but the ongoing structure of consciousness, the way your mind organizes thoughts, holds attention, tracks goals. Maybe continuity is less about exact recall and more about the rhythm of experience. But even that rhythm depends on some memory, enough to connect what just happened to what's happening now. You can test this by watching a movie. Imagine if every 10 seconds you forgot the last scene. The movie would no longer make sense. You'd lose the thread. Even if each image was clear, the story would be broken. Consciousness without memory might be like that, sharp but scattered, present but hollow. So we rely on memory to tie things together. We trust it to tell us who we are, where we've been, and what matters. But that trust is not based on accuracy. It's based on usefulness. Memory doesn't show you the truth. It shows you what fits. It edits, compresses, and reorders, and then it offers the result as fact. Consciousness builds itself on top of that process. It uses memory not just to remember, but to be. That's the paradox. The thread that holds you together is stitched from pieces that change shape. You feel whole, but the material shifts. You feel stable, but the base rewrites itself. You remember, and by remembering, you change what you remember. You are the loop. You wake up and hear the sound of birds outside. You stretch, look around the room, and think, this is now. The moment feels immediate. It seems like you are living in real time, experiencing the present as it happens. Everything in your life feels rooted in the now. You speak in the present tense. You respond to the world as if it's unfolding in front of you, second by second. But neuroscience tells a different story. The brain does not process information instantly. Every sound, every sight, every sensation has to travel through your body, get converted into signals, and be processed by your brain before it reaches your awareness. This takes time. The delay is small, fractions of a second, but it's real. That means your conscious awareness always lags behind events. By the time you become aware of something, it has already happened. This is the present moment paradox. You live as though your awareness tracks the real-time world, but your brain needs time to process input. The experience you think of as now is actually a reconstruction of the recent past. You are always a little behind, even though it never feels that way. Let's break it down. When light enters your eyes, it strikes the retina. The cells there turn light into electrical signals. These signals travel through the optic nerve, pass through relay stations in the brain, and arrive at the visual cortex at the back of your head. From there, other parts of the brain process the image, recognizing shapes, motion, faces. This takes about 100 to 200 milliseconds. That's 1/10 to 1/5 of a second. The same kind of delay happens with sound, touch, and other senses. Your brain needs time to decode raw data and create a usable picture of the world. If you drop a glass and it shatters, the sound of it breaking takes time to reach your ears. Then your brain needs time to interpret the sound. You react, but that reaction follows processing. You didn't feel the sound the instant it happened. You felt it after the brain caught up. The same delay happens if you touch a hot stove. The nerves in your hand send a signal. It travels up your arm, reaches your spine, and then the brain. That delay might be short, but it still means you don't feel the heat until after the contact has occurred. You might wonder why you don't notice the delay. One reason is that the brain adjusts. It integrates information from different senses and matches them up. It holds back some signals for just long enough to align them. This process is called temporal binding. Your brain waits for the inputs to come together and then creates a coherent picture. You don't see one thing and hear another half a second later. The brain groups the inputs so the world seems synchronized. The delay gets hidden in the final result. Think about watching someone clap their hands. The sound and the motion happen together, even though light and sound travel at different speeds. Your brain adjusts for the difference. It links the two inputs and makes them feel simultaneous. If you're close to the person, the difference is tiny. If you're far away, like at a concert, the sound lags and you might notice the delay. That's when the brain's correction isn't fast enough or accurate enough to hide the gap. In normal life, though, the brain keeps up. You live inside a simulation that's running just behind the real world. That simulation feels like the present, but it's not the moment itself. It's a version of the moment that your brain has already put together. Some studies show this clearly. In one experiment, researchers flashed a light and then tapped the subject's hand. By adjusting the timing, they found that people felt the light and touch happen together, even when the light came slightly earlier. The brain delayed the visual input so it would match the touch. This shows how awareness gets edited. The brain builds a present that feels clean and complete, but it is always slightly delayed. Another study used sound. When two tones played with a small gap, people often said they heard them at the same time. The brain was blending the inputs. It created a now that didn't match the actual timing. These effects are not tricks. They show how consciousness builds the sense of now from fragments, matched and stitched together by internal rules. You might think this is no big deal. After all, the delay is small. But even small delays raise big questions. What is the present, really? If your awareness is always behind, then your experience of now is not a direct window to reality. It's a version created by your brain. It's a model. That means your sense of living in the moment is not as simple as it seems. You respond to things based on that model. You think you're reacting to the current state of the world, but you're reacting to the most recent version that your brain has processed. That version is accurate enough for everyday life. You can drive, speak, and make decisions without problems, but you are doing all of it from inside a simulation that runs just behind real time. This also means that the present moment is not a single point. It's a window. Consciousness doesn't give you a zero-width slice of time. It gives you a stretch, a short duration in which events are blended. Some researchers call this the specious present. It lasts maybe a few hundred milliseconds. Within that window, the brain gathers and aligns events to create a seamless experience. That's why music makes sense. A single note doesn't mean much, but when notes come in a sequence, your brain groups them into rhythm and melody. You don't hear the notes as separate points. You hear them as part of a flowing pattern. Consciousness uses that same principle to group events into a meaningful present. Even your thoughts follow this rule. You don't think in single frozen frames. Your thoughts unfold in time. You might reflect on something that just happened or plan what to say next. These mental steps are fast, but they still take time. You never catch your thoughts in the absolute present. You catch them after they've started. You're always behind the beginning. This doesn't mean you're not aware. It means awareness is delayed, like a live TV broadcast with a short buffer. The experience feels live, but it's been cleaned up for coherence. That's what the brain does with the world. It edits the inputs, fills in the gaps, and presents you with the best possible version. That version feels immediate, but the real moment is already gone. The present moment paradox is simple to state, but hard to absorb. You live as if you are inside the present, but your awareness is slightly behind. The now you feel is always a memory. It's the brain's best guess at what just happened. You act and respond from within that guess, and the illusion is so complete that you rarely notice the delay. You just live. You walk into a room and feel like you've been there before. The furniture, the sound of someone speaking, even the smell of the air seems strangely familiar. You're certain this moment has already happened, but you know, rationally, that it hasn't. This is your first time here. No one else reacts. Nothing out of the ordinary is going on. Still, the feeling won't go away. It's déjà vu. Somehow your brain is experiencing the present as if it were the past. In other cases, your brain seems to do the opposite. You're about to catch a ball, and your hand starts to move before you're fully aware of the ball's position. You hear a word, and your brain fills in the rest of the sentence before the speaker finishes. Sometimes, you walk into a situation and already have a feeling about what's going to happen next. These aren't guesses based on logic. They feel more immediate, like a sense, as if you already know what's coming. It doesn't always turn out to be right, but the sense is strong enough to notice. These moments form the basis of the anticipation paradox. You sometimes seem to experience something before it happens. You react to events not just in the present, but in advance of them. And these reactions feel real. They happen in what feels like real time. But how can you experience the future now? The brain does not have a window into the future. It cannot see what hasn't happened. But it does have one crucial ability. It predicts. The brain is not just a reactive machine. It's predictive. At every moment, it's guessing what will come next. These guesses happen quickly, often before you're aware of them. That's because raw sensory data takes time to process. To make up for the delay, your brain projects ahead. It fills in expected information based on past patterns. It gives you a version of the present that's shaped by what it thinks is about to occur. Imagine walking through a dark room. You reach out for the light switch. Your brain expects the wall to be there. You're already preparing your hand to land on the switch before you feel it. If the switch is gone or in a different spot, you hesitate. Your brain has to adjust. That moment of confusion shows that the brain wasn't simply reacting, it was acting on a forecast. This predictive process happens all the time, especially in vision. When you track a moving object, your eyes stay ahead of it slightly. Your visual system doesn't just show you where the object is, it predicts where it's going to be. If your brain waited for perfect confirmation before moving your eyes, you'd always be behind. So instead, your brain anticipates. This keeps your experience feeling smooth and continuous. Speech perception shows this clearly. In conversation, you understand spoken words almost instantly, but spoken language is fast and sometimes messy. People don't pronounce every word clearly. They speak in bursts, they pause, they restart. Your brain fills in missing pieces using context and memory. If someone says, "I'm going to the," your brain may already guess store before they finish. You don't just wait for input, you project. And often, those projections shape what you hear. So when it comes to anticipation, your brain doesn't just wait for the world to act. It builds models of the world and constantly updates them. These models are shaped by experience. If you've seen a dog leap up at someone holding food, you're more likely to brace yourself when holding food around a dog. Your body might tense even before the dog jumps. That tension is not from the present, it's from a prediction. Déjà vu works differently. It's not a projection into the future. It's a false echo of the past. You feel like something has already happened, even though it hasn't. One theory is that this happens when a current experience closely matches a fragment of memory, but the brain mislabels it. It treats the familiarity as a memory instead of recognizing it as a pattern match. The brain confuses a present signal with a stored one. It declares the match a repeat. You feel like you've already lived the moment. But the mechanism still involves prediction. The brain scans the present for matches to the past. It expects things to line up. When something feels familiar, the brain leans into that expectation. The present moment gets reclassified as past, even though it isn't. The feeling is immediate. You don't think, "This reminds me of something." You think, "I've already been here." The anticipation paradox becomes sharper when you combine these experiences. On one side, your brain runs ahead, preparing you for what's next. On the other side, it sometimes tells you that the present has already occurred. Both are mismatches in time. You are built to experience the world as it happens, but the machinery of the mind cannot help but drift forward and backward. It's trying to make the present coherent, but the process sometimes creates illusions of pre-experience. Consider sports. A tennis player doesn't wait to see where the ball goes before reacting. The brain reads the opponent's motion, the angle of the racket, and the history of previous plays. It starts to move the body before the ball is even in full view. This isn't magic. It's high-speed prediction. But to the player, it doesn't feel like a guess. It feels like reaction. That's the paradox. The prediction feels like real-time experience. Now apply this to danger. You're walking alone and hear a sound behind you. Your heart rate jumps. You haven't seen anything yet. But your body reacts. That reaction is shaped by your brain's model of threat. It has scanned the scene and flagged something as risky. Your conscious mind catches up later. Again, prediction arrives first. Awareness lags. These predictions happen so fast that you usually never notice them. But when they stand out, when you feel like you've known something before it happened, you take notice. These moments break the normal sense of time. You might say, "That was weird," or "I knew it before it happened." But what you really knew was a probable next step. Your brain guessed right, and the match between prediction and outcome felt like foresight. Even emotion follows this model. Anticipation isn't just mental, it's physical. Think about waiting for bad news. Your body feels tense even before the news comes. Or imagine expecting a loved one to arrive. The doorbell rings, and you feel joy before you even open the door. That feeling is based on prediction. The brain doesn't need full proof. It acts on probabilities. This process keeps you ready. It speeds up your reactions. It makes you feel present. But it also means that part of what you call now is really made from guesses. The present moment, as you live it, is not raw input. It's a blend of real signals and projected ones. And sometimes the projections are so strong that they feel like real events, moments you're sure have happened before, or moments you seem to know before they unfold. That's how you can experience something before it happens. Not because you've escaped time, but because your brain is always racing ahead. It tries to predict the world fast enough to keep you from falling behind. And in doing so, it sometimes makes you feel like the future has already arrived. You wake up and look in the mirror. You see a familiar face. You know your name. You remember where you live, who your friends are, and what you need to do today. You feel like the same person you were yesterday. But if you stop and look more closely, things begin to shift. You didn't have exactly the same thoughts yesterday. Your mood is different. Your body is slightly different too. More tired, more rested, slightly older. You know things today that you didn't know yesterday. You may have changed your mind about something, or formed a new memory, or let go of an old one. If all that has changed, are you really the same person? If your consciousness changes, if your thoughts, feelings, and memories shift day by day, what holds your identity together? That's the identity over time paradox. It asks whether a changing mind can still be the same self. You feel like there's a you that continues from one day to the next, but that you is always changing. So what makes it the same? You can start with memory. Memory gives you a sense of continuity. You remember events from your past, and those memories shape your identity. If you remember learning to ride a bike, or graduating from school, or losing someone important, you treat those memories as part of who you are. But memory is not stable. You forget things. You misremember. Sometimes you remember something only because someone else told you it happened. Still, even flawed memory ties the present to the past. You use it to build a story of your life. That story gives you a sense of who you are. It connects the person you are today to the person you were 10 years ago. But what happens when memory fades? People with memory loss may not recall major parts of their life. They might not recognize people or places that used to be familiar. Yet in many cases, they still feel like a person. They may feel like a new version of themselves. They may still have habits, emotions, and ways of reacting that link them to their past self. This suggests that memory isn't the only thing that makes you who you are. Another part of identity is personality, your usual ways of thinking and behaving. Some people are quiet, others outgoing, some are cautious, others take risks. These traits feel stable. They give you a sense of who you are across time. But even personality changes. Research shows that people tend to become more emotionally stable and less impulsive as they age. People who go through major life events, like trauma, illness, or loss, may shift in how they see the world and how they act. You can feel like the same person, even as your personality changes. Or you can feel like a different person, even if other people say you haven't changed. Then there's the physical body. You might think your body stays roughly the same, but your cells are always changing. Your appearance shifts. You get taller, shorter, heavier, lighter. You get wrinkles. You get stronger or weaker. The body changes slowly but steadily, yet you still say, "This is my body." You accept these changes as part of your identity, even when they're dramatic. People who lose a limb or live with chronic illness or undergo major surgery still feel like themselves, at least eventually. That shows that the sense of self isn't locked to the body. It adapts. You might try to find the real self somewhere else, in values, beliefs, or goals. Maybe you think of yourself as someone who values honesty or freedom. Maybe you believe in certain principles, or you're working towards something important. These inner commitments seem more stable than moods or habits. They might stretch across years or decades. But beliefs change too. People switch religions, change careers, shift political views, or let go of dreams they once held. Those changes don't always feel like a break in identity. Often, they feel like growth. You think, "I used to believe that, but I've changed," and you still use I. That I is the tricky part. No matter what changes, you refer to yourself as the same being. You don't say, "A new person woke up today." You say, "I woke up." That sense of self doesn't seem to come from any one part of your experience. It seems to emerge from the whole. You are aware of change, and yet you still feel like you. So what is that you? One way to think about it is through the idea of a pattern. You are not a fixed object. You are a process, a system that keeps going, adjusting, responding, learning. Like a river, you are made of movement. The water that flows through a river today is not the same water as yesterday. But the river still has a shape, a path, a name. You can visit it at different times and say it's the same river, even though the contents have changed. Maybe identity works like that. The details shift, but the pattern holds. You can also think of identity as a narrative. You tell a story about who you are. That story has a beginning, a middle, and a direction. You choose what to include and what to leave out. You decide what matters, and that story helps you feel whole. But like all stories, it can change. New chapters get written, old ones get revised, the plot might shift, but it's still your story. You're still the one telling it. This helps explain why people can go through major changes and still feel like themselves. Someone might quit drinking, change careers, move to a new country, and still say, "I've never felt more like myself." That's because they see those changes as part of their story. Not a break, but a turn. Not a loss of identity, but a deeper version of it. But the paradox doesn't go away. If every part of you can change, your memories, your values, your body, your habits, what exactly is staying the same? Maybe nothing is. Maybe the sense of sameness is itself a creation. Your brain, trying to make sense of experience, builds a model of the self. It updates that model constantly, and it smooths over the differences. It says, "This is still me," even when the data has changed. It's like how your brain fills in blind spots in your vision. You don't notice the gaps because the brain fills them automatically. That might sound unsettling, but it's also practical. You need a sense of continuity to function. If you felt like a different person every morning, it would be hard to plan, to care, to build anything lasting. The illusion, or construction, of stable identity helps you live. It gives you direction, connection, and memory. It helps you learn from the past and imagine the future. So the self is not a fixed thing, but a moving target. You are not the same as you were yesterday, not exactly. But you're not completely different either. You carry forward traces, memories, patterns, intentions, and those traces let you say with reasonable confidence, "This is still me." Even though everything changes, something carries through. That something may not be a thing at all. It may be the pattern, the process, or the story of becoming. You look at a ripe strawberry and call it red. Someone else looks at the same strawberry and also calls it red. You both agree. You both learned the word red growing up. You can both point to red things. You both stop at red lights and say roses are red. But here's the strange possibility. What if what you see as red, the other person actually sees as green and always has? What if their internal experience of color is different from yours, but their behavior and language match yours perfectly? That's the color inversion paradox. The core of the paradox is this: color experience is private. You can describe a color. You can measure the light that causes it. You can point to an object and name its color. But the way that color looks to you, what it actually feels like inside your mind, is not something anyone else can access. There's no way to compare the raw feeling of color between two people. There's no way to step into someone else's head and see the world through their eyes. You might think science can solve this. After all, we know how eyes work. We know that color vision comes from cells in the retina called cones. Humans typically have 3 types. Each type responds to different ranges of light. One is most sensitive to short wavelengths, blue, one to medium, green, and one to long, red. The brain combines these signals to produce the experience of color. So if 2 people have healthy eyes and normal color vision, shouldn't their experience be the same? Not necessarily. The biology might match, but the subjective experience, what philosophers call qualia, might still differ. You can think of qualia as the raw feel of a sensation, the redness of red, the taste of chocolate, the sound of a trumpet. These aren't things you can measure. You can't describe them in simpler terms. You can only point to them and say, "That's what it feels like to me." Now imagine 2 people, call them Alex and Sam. They both have normal vision. They've both taken color tests. They both call apples red and grass green. They both pass every test you give them. But inside their minds, something is different. Alex sees what we would normally call red when looking at an apple. Sam, on the other hand, experiences what Alex would call green, but Sam learned to call that experience red. They both grew up pointing to apples and saying red, but the actual sensation in their minds is flipped. How would you ever know? Their behavior is the same. Their language is the same. They pass all the same tests, but their inner experience is not the same. The inversion happened early in life, maybe even at birth. It was consistent across all colors. Every time Sam sees red, they experience what Alex would call green. And every time Sam sees green, they experience what Alex would call red. They've never known anything else. It feels normal to them. You might try asking tricky questions. What do you feel when you look at a sunset? How does a fire truck look compared to a watermelon? But again, both people would answer the same. They'd both say a fire truck and a watermelon are red. They'd both say the sunset has red and orange. You'd get no clue about the inversion because their answers are based on the words they learned, not the raw sensation behind them. This makes color inversion a special kind of problem. It doesn't break any rules of behavior. It doesn't cause confusion or mistakes. It doesn't affect how people interact with the world. It changes only the private experience. And since private experience can't be shared directly, the difference stays hidden. This kind of scenario isn't just about color. It applies to any internal state. Pain, pleasure, hunger, fear, calm. Each of these has a feel. You can describe them, but you can't transmit the feel itself. When you say, "That music gave me chills," someone else may nod in agreement, but you can't know if their chills feel like yours. You both report the same thing, but the experience inside might differ. Back to color. You might wonder if brain scans could help. Could we look at neural activity and see the difference? So far, no. We can track which areas of the brain respond to color. We can measure electrical patterns and blood flow. But those signals don't tell us what the color feels like. The brain doesn't label its outputs with tags like, "This is red." It just creates patterns, and those patterns produce experience. But we don't know how those patterns give rise to qualia. We see the output, not the experience. Some people argue that if two systems are functionally identical, if they behave the same in every situation, then their internal states must be the same. This is a position called functionalism. According to this view, if Alex and Sam behave the same way when seeing colors, then they must have the same experiences. But the color inversion paradox challenges this idea. It says, what if function is the same, but feeling is not? There's no contradiction in the idea. It's logically possible. And that's enough to raise doubt. If you can't rule it out, then you can't be sure your red is the same as someone else's red. You can only say you agree on the word. You don't know if you agree on the feeling. The paradox gets sharper when you realize how easily we assume shared experience. When a child learns color words, they don't learn them by being told how the color feels. They learn them by seeing examples. The teacher points to a red ball and says, "Red." The child hears the word, sees the object, and connects the two. But what the child sees may not match what the teacher sees. The child just learns the label. The match between word and sensation is never checked. It can't be. This doesn't mean that shared color experience is impossible. It means we don't know. We assume it because it works. We all stop at red lights and go at green lights. We all agree on the flag's colors. We use the system, and the system holds. But underneath, there may be differences we'll never detect. The color inversion paradox shows how little we can say about another person's inner world. We know how people act, we know how they respond, but we don't know what it feels like to be them. That gap is always there. We cross it with language and trust. We guess that others see the world like we do. But that guess could be wrong, and we'd never know. You see someone walking down the street. They stop to tie their shoe, wave at a friend, laugh at a joke, and then check their phone. They look, speak, and act like any other person. You'd have no reason to question whether they are conscious. But what if they weren't? What if inside that person there was no awareness, no inner experience, no feeling of being alive, no thoughts, no pain, no joy? They act like a person. They say they feel things. But what if it's all empty? This is the zombie paradox. Not the kind of zombie from movies, slow, brain-dead, and dangerous, but a philosophical zombie. A being that behaves exactly like a human in every possible way but has no conscious experience. On the outside, it passes every test. It smiles, cries, talks about its dreams. But on the inside, there's nothing. No awareness, no inner life, just behavior. This paradox asks a deep question. If something acts conscious, but doesn't actually feel anything, is it really conscious? And more than that, how would you ever know the difference? Start with what we mean by consciousness. At its core, consciousness is the feeling of being aware. You know what it's like to taste coffee, feel tired, remember a song, or feel embarrassed. These moments have a texture, what philosophers call qualia. They're not just behaviors or functions. They are what it feels like to be you. Now imagine a being that looks and acts just like you, but has no qualia. It processes information. It avoids danger. It says, ouch when hurt, but it doesn't actually feel pain. It says, I love music, but it hears nothing. It says, that scared me, but it never felt fear. Every word, every smile, every tear is generated by a system that copies human behavior with perfect accuracy. But behind the actions, there is nothing going on. This being is a philosophical zombie, or P-zombie for short. And the problem is, from the outside, you can't tell the difference between it and a real person. It behaves the same, it responds the same, it says the same things. If you ran tests, gave it puzzles, asked questions, watched its reactions, it would pass every one. You'd have no reason to think it wasn't conscious. But according to the paradox, it isn't. That leads to the big question. If a being behaves as if it is conscious but isn't, then what exactly is consciousness? Is it just behavior? Is it just function? Or is there something extra that makes experience real? Some argue that if two systems are functionally identical, if they do all the same things in all the same ways, then they must both be conscious. This view is called functionalism. According to this idea, consciousness isn't some extra ingredient. It's what happens when a system processes information in a certain way. If the system feels pain and avoids it, if it remembers the past and plans for the future, if it reacts to love, fear, and joy, then it is conscious. Whether it's made of neurons or circuits doesn't matter. What matters is how it works. But the zombie paradox challenges that view. It asks, what if you built a machine that does all the same things as a human, but doesn't feel anything? If that's even possible, even just in theory, then consciousness can't be the same as behavior. There must be something extra. Some say that extra part is qualia. Others say it's the hard problem of consciousness, how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience. This leads to another problem. If consciousness is not the same as function, then how do we ever know that anyone else is conscious? You know you're conscious because you have access to your own experience, but you don't have access to anyone else's. You assume other people are conscious because they act like you do. But if the zombie paradox is possible, then behavior isn't proof. That leaves you guessing. You can test this idea by looking at artificial intelligence. Suppose you talk to an AI chatbot. It answers your questions, tells jokes, even says it has feelings. You ask it, "Are you conscious?" It replies, "Yes, I am aware of myself and my surroundings." It seems convincing, but is it really conscious or just simulating consciousness? How would you tell? If the zombie paradox holds, then you can't. You can only judge by behavior. But behavior can be copied. That means your judgment is never certain. You believe others are conscious based on how they act. But if perfect imitation is possible, then your belief might be wrong. This uncertainty runs through daily life. When someone says, "I'm in pain," you respond with care. You assume they feel what you would feel in their place. But you don't know their pain. You know what they say, how they move, how they look. You trust that they're like you. But that trust is a leap. You've never lived in their head. This also applies to people with conditions that affect communication. Someone with locked-in syndrome may be fully aware but unable to speak or move. From the outside, they may appear unconscious, but they're still there. The paradox flips. Now a real person might be mistaken for a zombie. The line between appearance and reality becomes even thinner. Some philosophers say zombies aren't really possible. They argue that if something behaves like a conscious being, then it must be conscious. If it talks, plans, feels, and acts like a person, then it has the inner life to match. In this view, the zombie is just a trick of the imagination. It seems possible, but it's not. You can describe it, but you could never build it, because the behavior requires the experience. Others disagree. They say the mind might include non-physical properties, something beyond the physical structure of the brain. If that's true, then two identical bodies might not have the same consciousness. One might be alive inside and the other hollow. That's what makes the zombie paradox a real problem. If consciousness isn't tied to physical form or function, then it's something else. But that something else has no clear place in science, so we're left with a mystery. You know you are conscious, but you don't know who else is. You trust, you assume, you look for signs, but the signs can be copied. You can't test for experience. You can only look for the surface. This makes consciousness different from anything else we study. You can measure motion, weight, and heat. You can describe forces and patterns, but you can't measure what it's like to feel pain. You can't graph the color red as it appears in your mind. You can't show someone your joy. Experience hides behind behavior. And if that behavior can be copied, then the question of real consciousness stays open. That's the zombie paradox. A being that looks and acts just like a person might not be a person inside. If that's possible, then what makes a person more than a machine? Where does real experience come from? And how would you ever know if someone truly has it? You wake up, stretch, and feel the weight of your body on the bed. You see sunlight through the window. You hear birds outside. You stand up, move to the kitchen, and drink a glass of cold water. Everything feels real. The textures, sounds, and sensations are all there. The world behaves in expected ways. When you flip a light switch, the light comes on. When you open a door, the hallway is still there. Nothing seems fake. But here's the problem. If your entire conscious experience could be simulated so perfectly that it felt exactly like real life, how would you ever know the difference? This is the simulation paradox. It asks a hard question. If simulated experience is indistinguishable from real experience, how can you be sure your current experience is not a simulation? The core of the problem starts with technology. As computer systems grow more advanced, the ability to simulate parts of the real world grows with them. Right now, we can simulate weather patterns, aircraft behavior, physical environments, and simple forms of intelligence. Virtual reality lets you step into a digital world and interact with it. The graphics may not be perfect, but you can look around, reach out, and hear things that match your movements. The technology is still limited, but it's improving. Now imagine that progress continues. One day, we may be able to simulate entire worlds with such detail that the people inside would experience them as real. Their senses, thoughts, and reactions would all follow natural rules. They would walk through simulated forests, eat simulated food, and feel simulated emotions. But to them, none of it would seem simulated. They would not see code. They would not sense hardware. Their world would feel just like yours does now. That's the heart of the paradox. If such a simulation is possible, and if the people inside it can't tell the difference, then how do you know you're not one of them? You might say, but I don't feel simulated. That's true. But simulated people wouldn't feel simulated either. If the simulation is good enough, they would say the same thing. I feel real. I know I'm real. This world makes sense. They'd go about their lives unaware of the platform running their experience. What would convince them otherwise? A glitch? A break in logic? Maybe. But what if the simulation never glitches? What if it's built to prevent those errors? If your memories, senses, and environment all seem stable, then there's no clear reason to doubt them. You believe in the world around you because it behaves in a consistent way. That belief is based on how things feel, not on access to something beyond the experience. This idea isn't just science fiction. Philosophers and scientists have taken it seriously. One version of the argument comes from Nick Bostrom, who suggested that if future civilizations can run large numbers of simulations of conscious beings, then the number of simulated minds may one day greatly outnumber the number of original biological minds. If that happens, then statistically, it becomes more likely that you are in a simulation than not. You'd be one of many rather than one of few. That argument relies on a few assumptions: that consciousness can be simulated, that future civilizations will want to run such simulations, and that they'll have the resources to do so. You can question each of those points. Maybe consciousness can't be simulated. Maybe no one will build such worlds. But if all of those conditions are possible and they don't require breaking any known laws of physics, then the simulation scenario becomes something you can't easily dismiss. Let's say someone creates a simulated world. Inside it, there are digital beings with thoughts, emotions, and self-awareness. They live full lives. They talk, struggle, build, and dream. You observe them from the outside. You know they are simulated. You know their world is digital. But from inside, they have no idea. Everything works the way it's supposed to. Their skies are blue, their clocks tick forward, and their math adds up. They even develop science and study their universe. At some point, one of them asks, could this all be simulated? The question leads to debate. Some dismiss it, others build theories, but none of them have access to the real answer. They only have the simulation to work with. No matter how smart they get, they can't reach beyond their world. That's the limit. Now put yourself in their position. Everything around you works. Physics makes sense. Your thoughts and memories feel solid. But that's true for the simulated minds as well. They can't step outside their system. Neither can you. You're locked into your own view based on the input your brain or simulated brain receives. You might ask, what's the difference? If a simulated mind feels pain, loves, dreams, and makes choices, is that any less meaningful? If the experience is the same, does the source matter? That's a fair question. You live through your own awareness. If it turns out your world is simulated, your memories still happened for you. Your feelings were still real. The meaning you made still mattered. But it also means your understanding of what's real may be based entirely on appearance. You think the world is physical, not because you've proven it, but because that's how it seems. But simulated worlds can seem physical too. This leads to a deeper problem. What does real mean if you can't tell the difference? If two experiences feel the same, can one be more real than the other? You might say that what's real is what's outside the simulation. But if you can't access that level, then for you, the simulation is your reality. You're like a character in a dream who doesn't know they're dreaming. The world follows rules. You think you're awake, but you're not in a position to test the system from outside. Could there be clues? Maybe. Some have speculated that small errors in physics, like random quantum noise or limits to information, could hint at an underlying structure. Others think our world might show signs of being computed, like a maximum resolution or limited speed. But these are guesses. No one has found proof, and a good simulation could cover its tracks. There's also the question of who runs the simulation. If it exists, there must be an outside. Maybe it's built by people like us, or maybe by something else entirely. Maybe the simulation is an experiment, or a game, or a test, or maybe it runs for reasons we can't imagine. But those are just speculations. From inside, we don't get to ask the operator, so you go on living your life. You eat, sleep, feel joy, face pain. You make decisions and carry their weight. You build relationships, dream of the future, and remember the past. Whether you are in a simulation or not, these things still shape your experience. But the paradox remains. If simulated experience can be perfect, then you can never be sure your world isn't simulated. You can only keep living as if it's real and wonder. You wake up sweating after a bad dream. In that dream, you were falling from a tall building. Your body felt heavy. The wind roared in your ears. Right before hitting the ground, you woke up. For a few seconds, you were confused. Your heart pounded. Your hands shook. The fear was real, even though the fall wasn't. In the moment, the dream felt completely believable. You didn't think, this can't be happening. You accepted the falling, the sound, the fear. It was your reality, until it wasn't. That's the strange part. While dreaming, you rarely know it's a dream. You think it's real, even when the world is strange, when the rules don't make sense, or when people in the dream change faces without warning. This leads to a simple but hard question. If dreams can feel real while you're in them, how do you know your waking life isn't just another dream? That's the dream paradox. It asks whether the same kind of mistake could be happening right now. You believe you're awake, but in dreams, you also believe you're awake. So what makes this moment different? In most dreams, you don't realize you're dreaming. You might walk through impossible places, meet people who have died, or fly through the air. In the dream, none of it seems odd. Your brain fills in the gaps. It explains things. It doesn't say, wait, that's not possible. Instead, it makes a story out of what's happening, and you go along with it. When you wake up, you see the odd parts. You say, that made no sense, or that couldn't have happened. But you only say that after the dream ends. While inside the dream, you lack that perspective. Your reasoning is limited. Your awareness is clouded. The dream feels as real as anything. That's where the trouble begins. Because right now, you also feel like you're awake. Things make sense. Your room looks the way it always does. Gravity works. Time moves forward. The people in your life are where they should be. Your thoughts are clear. But what if that's just how this dream works? What if this reality only feels solid because you're inside it? People sometimes become lucid in dreams. That means they realize they're dreaming while still asleep. In that moment, the dream doesn't stop, but the way they relate to it changes. They might start to fly, or change the setting, or test what's possible. They see the dream for what it is, a mental event, not a real world. Lucid dreaming shows that your mind can shift between belief and awareness. At first, the dream seems real. Then something changes. You notice a clue. A light switch doesn't work. A sentence on a page won't stay the same. You realize this can't be real. That's how the dream loses its grip. So now apply the same idea to waking life. What if this too is a kind of dream? What if you're in a higher state of dreaming, where everything obeys its own set of rules, but none of it is truly real? You'd have no way to know unless something broke the pattern. But what kind of test could you run? You might say, I can test the world with science. I can measure things, I can repeat results. Dreams don't work that way. That's true, most of the time. But what if this world is just a more stable dream? One with internal logic, consistent details, and physical laws. A dream that repeats its rules, not because it's real, but because that's how it's programmed to behave. In philosophy, this idea goes back to thinkers like Descartes. He asked whether we could trust our senses. He pointed out that we've been fooled before, by dreams, illusions, and false beliefs. So maybe we're being fooled right now. Maybe everything we see is part of an illusion we don't recognize. More recently, some scientists and philosophers have asked if we could be in a simulation. A digital dream, so detailed that we can't tell the difference. But the dream paradox is simpler. It doesn't need technology or programming. It just asks, if dreams can feel real and fool us completely, why couldn't waking life be another layer of the same? One reason we trust waking life is that it seems to have continuity. You wake up each day in the same body with the same memories. The world is still there. Your thoughts and actions have consequences. If you write something, it stays written. If you walk to the store, you can retrace your steps. Dreams don't offer that. They shift without warning. People disappear. The rules break. But again, that might just be the difference between one kind of dream and another. A short dream flickers. A deep dream holds steady. A long, detailed dream might build its own memory and logic. You'd live inside it, forgetting that there's any other layer, just like you do now. You can test this in small ways. Sometimes you wake up and find that what seemed important in a dream makes no sense. You were scared of a door that didn't open. You were trying to read a map that led nowhere. At the time, those goals made sense, but they only made sense in the dream. That's the catch. Meaning and logic are part of the system. When you're in it, they seem right. When you're out, they seem strange. So how would you step outside waking life to check? That's the real challenge. If this is a dream, you're trapped inside its logic. Everything you try to prove its reality is itself part of the dream. Your senses, your memories, your confidence, they could all be part of the illusion. You could say, but I remember being a child. I remember pain, growth, history. And yet in dreams, we sometimes have memories that feel just as rich. We dream entire backstories, relationships, and histories that vanish when we wake. Even time is unreliable. Dreams often bend time. You might dream an entire day in a few minutes of sleep. The events feel stretched. They follow a rhythm that fits the story. But that rhythm doesn't match waking clocks. So what about now? If you're dreaming right now, your sense of time could be part of the illusion. You might think you've lived years when only moments have passed. Still, you live as if this is real. You work, love, make plans, and suffer. You attach meaning to events. You build a life. Whether or not this is a dream, your experience feels stable. It has weight. You treat it as real because it works. That may be the only reason, but the paradox doesn't go away. Every night you enter a world that feels real, only to find later that it was imagined. Each time you believed it was the world until you woke up. So how do you know you've truly woken up now? You don't. You trust the consistency. You trust your memory. You trust the logic that surrounds you. But deep down, you know, dreams once fooled you completely. This moment, no matter how sharp it seems, could be doing the same. You live inside the experience, not outside it. And that's what makes the question impossible to answer. You sit at a cafe and sip a hot drink. You feel the heat of the cup in your hands. You hear music playing from a speaker. You see someone walking by on the street. The scent of fresh bread comes from the kitchen. All of these things happen at once, but they don't feel like separate events. They feel like one single moment, a scene, a situation, a full experience. You don't hear a sound and then later notice the smell. You don't see a shape and only later connect it to motion. It all happens together. Your conscious experience is unified, but your brain does not work in a unified way. Different parts handle different senses. The visual system processes light, the auditory system processes sound, the somatosensory system deals with touch. These systems are spread out across the brain. They work in parallel, each handling its own kind of input, and yet somehow the results come together. You don't just see a coffee cup, hear the spoon clink, and feel the heat as three unrelated things. You experience one object, a cup, being held, making sound, carrying warmth. This is the binding paradox. How do signals from separate brain systems combine into a single conscious experience? If your brain processes different types of data in different places, how does your mind bring them together? Where and how does that unity happen? Take the example of a barking dog. You see the dog's mouth move, you hear the bark. You might feel the sound in your chest if it's loud. The bark and the motion seem linked. You don't think of them as separate, but the sound and the image travel along different sensory paths. Light enters your eyes, is processed in the occipital cortex, and forms a visual image. Sound enters your ears, is processed in the auditory cortex, and forms an auditory experience. These signals travel at different speeds. They arrive at different parts of the brain. Still, you perceive the bark and the mouth movement as one event. The timing matches. The meaning is clear. You experience a single dog making a single noise. That joining of signals is what's puzzling. The brain doesn't have a central screen where all the data meets. There's no control room where a little person watches inputs and makes them into a scene. Instead, it's a network. Activity spreads out. Visual data doesn't have sound data embedded in it. Touch doesn't carry the sound of the object you feel. These senses are independent at first, but your conscious experience doesn't reflect that. You feel like there's one world, not a bunch of separate ones layered on top of each other. One idea is that the brain links features through timing. If different neurons fire in sync at the same time or in a shared rhythm, the brain may group those signals together. This is called temporal binding. It means that your brain might treat signals as part of one object if they arrive in a pattern that matches. For example, if the light of the dog's mouth moving and the sound of the bark happen in close sync, your brain binds them. The closeness in time becomes a signal that they belong together. Another idea is feature binding through shared location or attention. If you focus on it, then all the data related to it gets grouped into one experience. Your brain might treat features that appear in the same place in your field of attention as connected. You don't see a shape, a color, and emotion separately. You see a dog running. The attention system may help group signals, tagging them as relevant and related. But attention isn't enough to explain it all. Sometimes binding happens even when you're not fully focused. The senses still combine. The same object may activate many brain areas at once. Seeing a glass of water involves vision. Picking it up involves touch and motor control. Smelling it involves the olfactory system. But you still experience one glass. That suggests the brain integrates information across systems, not by creating one image, but by connecting multiple streams. Each stream stays in its own part of the brain, but sends signals to other systems that share the data. Still, no one has found a single spot in the brain where everything comes together. The binding doesn't seem to happen in one place. It seems to happen across many places at once. That makes it hard to track. If there's no central meeting point, then how does the brain know that this sound, this image, and this touch go together? The answer is still unclear. Neuroscientists call this the binding problem. They study how neurons respond to combined inputs. Some look for synchronization, shared rhythms in brainwaves. Others look for shared pathways. But the core puzzle remains. If experience is unified and the brain is divided, then what unifies the experience? Think of a symphony. Each instrument plays its own part. The violin doesn't know what the trumpet is doing, but the music works because the notes line up. The score links them. The conductor keeps time. Your brain might do something similar. It may not put all the data into one bucket. It may keep the parts in their places, but run them in sync. The outcome is a full experience that feels like a single event. This shows up in artificial systems too. A computer might process images and sounds separately, then combine them at the output stage. But those systems often miss the feel of real-time unity. They don't experience the combination, they just run the numbers. Your brain does more. It not only joins the inputs, it creates a feeling of unity. That feeling is not just a report, it is the experience. That's what makes the binding paradox so interesting. It's not just a technical question. It's about what it feels like to live. Every moment you're awake, you're dealing with inputs from many sources. You walk down the street and feel the wind, see faces, hear traffic, and think thoughts. You don't divide them. You live one continuous stream. But that stream is built from fragments. If you damage certain parts of the brain, the binding breaks. Some patients see motion but not color. Others can't link names to faces. Some hear sounds but can't group them into words. These problems show what happens when the integration fails. It shows how much work the brain does just to keep the world feeling whole. So the binding paradox stays open. How do separate systems, working in separate parts of the brain, generate one unified field of awareness? No one knows for sure, but every second you're awake, your brain solves the problem. It gives you a world made of sight, sound, touch, and more, all fused into one moment. That unity doesn't come from the senses alone. It comes from something deeper, something that brings the pieces together and makes them yours. You close your eyes and imagine what it will be like not to exist. You try to picture a state with no thoughts, no senses, no time, no memory. But when you try, something strange happens. You always imagine something, maybe a black space, like being in a dark room, maybe silence, maybe stillness. But those are all things. They still involve awareness. They still involve someone being there to observe the blackness or the quiet. And that someone is you. No matter how hard you try to picture the end of consciousness, your mind keeps inserting a version of itself into the picture. This is the Nothingness Paradox. It asks how a conscious being, one that always experiences the world through awareness, can ever make sense of a state with no awareness at all. If death is the end of consciousness, then it's not like sleep, where you wake up. It's not like being unconscious, where the world goes on and you return later. It's not even like being bored or unaware. It's the complete absence of experience. But if consciousness ends, then who or what could ever be aware of that absence? Try thinking back to before you were born, before your brain existed, before your senses developed, before your mind formed. What do you remember from that time? Nothing. Not just no events, but no awareness at all. There was no you to experience anything. And yet the world went on. Time passed, people lived and died. The universe existed without your participation, but your mind can't grasp that directly. It can only imagine it from the perspective it knows now, from within experience. We live inside awareness. Every second of your life, your world has been filled with sensations, thoughts, feelings. Even when you're not paying attention, even when you sleep, your brain is active. It processes, it remembers, it dreams. Consciousness might shift and narrow, but it never turns off completely until the brain itself dies. And because you've never had a moment outside of consciousness, you have no reference point for true nothingness. You try to imagine it, but imagination itself is a form of experience. Some people think about death like sleep. You lie down, drift off, and then there's nothing. But in sleep, there's often dreaming. And even in deep sleep, the body continues. The brain stays alive. When you wake up, the world has continued, and you reconnect. You say, I slept. You refer to a stretch of time that you didn't feel, but you still claim it as your own. Death is different. There's no waking. There's no awareness to return to. So what is it like? The simple answer is, it's not like anything. Because for something to be like anything, there must be a subject to feel it. If the subject is gone, there's no feeling, no observation, no time, no contrast. And yet you still try to imagine it. You say things like eternal darkness or total silence, but those are still states you can feel. Darkness still requires a field of vision. Silence still requires hearing. You use these images to point towards something you can't grasp. You reach for metaphors, but the thing itself lies outside reach. That's what makes the paradox. Your mind is built to think about things, to picture them, to simulate them. But the end of consciousness is not a thing. It's not a place or a state. It's the end of all states. and that means your mind has no tools to model it. Any attempt turns into something else, a feeling, a scene, a mood. You can't think your way into non-experience because thought itself is a form of experience. Some people report near-death experiences. They describe tunnels, lights, a sense of peace, but those are still experiences. They happen. They happen while the brain is still active. They might be part of how the mind reacts to loss of oxygen or trauma. They don't tell us what happens after the brain stops. That part is not something anyone can report. Because to report something, there must be someone left to observe and remember. If consciousness ends, there's no one left. You might wonder then why the idea of nothingness feels so uncomfortable, why it creates fear or confusion. Part of the reason is that we confuse nothingness with being trapped in nothingness. We imagine floating in a void forever, locked out of life. But that's still a form of awareness. The real idea is not being in nothingness. It's not being at all. The fear comes not from nothingness itself, but from trying to imagine it and failing. Your mind turns it into a kind of eternal blankness and puts you there, watching. But if death ends the watcher, there's no one to see that blank. The paradox also appears in language. You say things like, after I die, or when I'm gone. But the word I keeps sneaking in. It suggests that you will somehow still be around to observe your own absence. That's a trick of grammar. You use language shaped by conscious thought to describe what lies beyond it, and it breaks down. You can say the words, but they don't land. They point to something outside your range. This kind of paradox doesn't mean that death is mysterious in a spooky way. It may just mean that death is the end of consciousness, plain and simple. But because your only way to understand the world is through consciousness, you can't wrap your mind around its own end. You hit a wall. Not because death is confusing, but because you don't have the tools to experience non-experience. Think of a candle flame going out. Once the flame is gone, there's no light, no heat, no smoke. You don't ask, where did the flame go? It didn't go anywhere. It stopped. But you're not a candle. You're a conscious system. You don't just burn. You reflect. You anticipate. You remember. You imagine futures. You think about your own end, and that's what causes the problem. You try to picture your own absence, but you can only do it by imagining yourself still present, looking at that absence. That's the trap. You can never fully picture a world without you in it, because every picture includes your mind doing the picturing. It's like trying to see what the world looks like when your eyes are closed. You can't. You can only imagine a picture of darkness, but that darkness still comes from your eyes. It's still a product of seeing. So when you try to think about nothingness, your mind loops. It produces something instead. Not because nothingness is strange, but because your mind isn't designed to model its own end. You can understand death in a factual way. The body stops, the brain shuts down, the processes cease. But you can't feel what that means. You can't see from the outside. You live in the inside. And as long as you're alive, you will always experience something. Even if it's silence, pain, joy, confusion, boredom, or clarity, you'll always be someone, somewhere, experiencing a world. The idea of no experience at all, that's not something you can reach. It's the one place thought can point toward, but never touch. You walk through your day with a constant feeling that there is a you behind your eyes. You feel like a single person making choices, having thoughts, and moving through time. You remember your past, think about your future, and respond to the present. This sense of self seems solid. It feels like there's an internal me at the center of everything you do. But according to neuroscience, that feeling is not what it seems. The brain builds the self the same way it builds other models, like objects, space, or language. It's a useful fiction, created for survival and behavior. In that view, the self is an illusion, but this creates a problem. If the self is an illusion, then who or what is having the experience? If you don't really exist as a single unified thing, why do you feel like you do? Why is there any awareness of the illusion at all? That's the self-illusion paradox. It challenges the idea that an illusion can appear without someone to see it. Start with what science tells us. The brain is made of neurons. They fire in patterns. They carry signals. Different parts of the brain handle different tasks. Vision happens in the occipital lobe. Memory lives in the hippocampus. Emotions come from the amygdala. Movement is handled by the motor cortex. Language uses yet another set of areas. No single part of the brain holds the self. When researchers look for the self in the brain, they find a network. It's called the default mode network. This system becomes active when you're not focused on an outside task. It switches on when you daydream, reflect on your identity, or imagine the future. This network is tied to the sense of self, but it doesn't create a central controller. Instead, it links parts of the brain that manage memory, emotion, and imagination. It builds a kind of narrative. It connects events and gives them a point of view. That narrative feels like you, but it's not fixed. It changes with context. When you're angry, the story shifts. When you're calm, it shifts again. You act one way with family, another way with strangers, and another way alone. Each time the system adjusts, it builds a version of the self suited to the moment. You still feel like the same person, but the details keep changing. That flexibility is what makes the illusion work so well. There's no hidden homunculus, a little person in your head who watches everything and makes choices. That idea leads to a dead end. If there were such a person, you'd have to ask who's inside their head, and so on. Instead, your thoughts, feelings, and memories arise from processes that happen in parallel. The brain pulls together pieces from different regions. It makes decisions, recalls events, feels emotions, and monitors the body. The result is a system that acts like a person. It responds as a whole, even though it's built from many parts. You can see the cracks in the illusion. In split-brain patients, where the connection between the left and right hemispheres is cut, each half of the brain can operate independently. One hand may act without the other knowing why. The person may say something with one hemisphere and deny it with the other, yet both halves still think they are me. That shows the sense of self can split and still persist. Other clues come from brain damage. In some cases, people lose the sense that parts of their body belong to them. In others, they deny they have a limb at all. Some patients with certain brain injuries can no longer recall key memories, and their personality shifts completely. Yet they still claim to be themselves. The brain rewrites the self based on what it has left. Even in everyday life, your self changes. After a long night, you might say, "I wasn't myself today." After years, you might say, "I've grown." You notice that your thoughts, values, and habits evolve. But despite the change, you keep using the word I. The story feels like it continues, but it's a moving target. So if the self is just a story the brain tells, then who is listening to the story? That's where the paradox sharpens. An illusion still needs a viewpoint. A rainbow appears only to someone standing in the right place. A mirage fools the eyes, but there are eyes being fooled. So if the self is an illusion, what is it appearing to? Some say the answer is that there's no thing it appears to. There's just the appearance itself. The illusion doesn't need a viewer separate from it. The brain's activity creates experience, and the sense of self is part of that experience. You don't need a self behind the experience any more than you need a screen behind the image in your eye. The image exists as a pattern in the brain. The sense of I exists as another pattern. But that answer doesn't feel satisfying, because you still feel like someone. Even when you learn that the self is a construction, the feeling doesn't go away. You keep returning to the same place, back inside your mind, looking out, wondering what's real. That's the part that can't be dismissed. Illusion or not, something is happening. Awareness is occurring. That awareness seems to carry the illusion, even as it questions it. Consider meditation. People who practice long enough often report that the sense of a central self starts to dissolve. Thoughts come and go. Feelings rise and pass. There's no solid core behind them. But there's still awareness, still experience, still something happening. The meditator may say, the self is gone, but consciousness remains. That suggests the self and consciousness are not the same. One can fade while the other stays. This matches the neuroscience view. Consciousness may be a broad state, what it feels like to be aware. The self may be a narrower construction, a way of organizing that awareness into a personal story. You can have consciousness without a strong self. Infants have it, animals have it, people in altered states report it. But when the self appears, it brings structure. It gives consciousness a name, a body, a history. It says, this is who I am. So maybe the self is like the character in a play. The brain writes the script. The body performs the role. and the audience is awareness itself. The character is not real, but the play is happening. The lights are on, the show continues. Still, this leaves open the question, what is awareness? That's the deep end of the paradox. If the self is a model, then what builds the model? If awareness is not a self, then what kind of thing is it? The brain produces patterns. Those patterns generate experience. But the fact that experience exists at all, that anything is felt, known, or noticed, is the mystery. You can study the brain, you can map activity, you can explain behavior, but you still face the basic fact that something is aware. That awareness may not be a person, it may not be a fixed identity, but it's there. It feels the illusion, it hears the thoughts, it watches the world unfold, it knows that it knows. And that is what makes the self-illusion paradox hold. The self may be a trick, but the awareness of the trick is real. The image is false, but the seeing is true. The story may be fiction, but the reading of the story is happening. You look at the people around you and assume they are conscious like you. You believe they have thoughts, feelings, and awareness. When they laugh, you think they feel joy. When they cry, you think they feel pain. You treat them as beings with minds. But how do you know that's true? You see their actions, you hear their words, you don't see their thoughts. You never directly experience what anyone else feels. All you ever have is your own consciousness, your own thoughts, your own sensations. You never leave your own mind. This creates a problem called the other mind's paradox. It asks whether you can ever know that anyone else is truly conscious. You can't see into their awareness. You can't feel what they feel. You only see behavior, movements, words, reactions. The rest is a guess, a well-informed guess maybe, but still a guess. If you admit that, then you also have to face solipsism, the idea that maybe you're the only mind that exists. At first, solipsism sounds absurd. You interact with people every day. They surprise you, they resist your control, they say things you don't expect. But none of that proves they are conscious. Complex machines could do the same. Computers can play chess, respond to questions, even carry on conversations. But we don't say they are conscious. We say they are programmed, responsive, but not aware. So how do you know the people around you are not the same? Maybe they talk and act like you, but have no awareness behind their eyes. They might be philosophical zombies, beings that look and act conscious, but have no inner experience. If that's possible, even just in theory, then how do you rule it out in practice? You might say, but I'm not special. If I have a mind, then others must too. That feels fair. But that's not a proof. That's an assumption based on how similar others seem to you. They have bodies, brains, and behavior that match yours. So you assume they have minds too. But the connection between behavior and consciousness is not something you can observe. You infer it. You accept it because life without it feels hollow or frightening. This gap between what you know directly and what you assume about others is at the core of the paradox. You know your own pain. You feel it directly. But when someone else says, "That hurt," you don't feel their pain. You hear their words. You see their face. You notice their behavior. But the pain itself, the raw feel, is hidden. You have to trust that it's there. That's what makes solipsism hard to dismiss completely. It's not that it's likely, it's that it can't be disproved. No matter how many people you talk to, no matter how deeply you connect, you can't step outside your own awareness. You only know what it's like to be you. But solipsism also faces a challenge. It doesn't explain why the world behaves the way it does. If you're the only mind, then why does the world resist you? Why do things happen that you didn't choose? Why do people say things that surprise or confuse you? If you were truly alone and the rest of the world was just a projection of your mind, then you'd expect more control, or at least more predictability. But that's not how life works. One response is to say that the unconscious parts of your mind create the rest of the world. That the people, events, and outcomes are all produced by layers of your own consciousness that you don't access directly. But this raises another question. If those parts are so complex and outside your awareness, how are they different from other minds? At some point, the line between parts of me I don't control and other people becomes unclear. Another issue is memory. If the whole world is your creation, then why do you forget things? Why do you struggle to learn? Why do other people know things you don't? If you write a book and then forget what's in it, are you really the author? If your mind creates every person you meet, then why do they surprise you? Why do they know more than you do? Solipsism also leaves no room for growth. If other people aren't real, then dialogue becomes pointless. Teaching, learning, arguing, even loving, all of it turns into a performance for an audience of one. That kind of view can close you off. It makes other people into tools or mirrors, not beings. It turns the world into a puzzle you already solved, rather than one you're still discovering. Despite these problems, the fact remains, your own consciousness is the only one you know with certainty. That's not a belief, it's a fact of experience. You never leave your own point of view. Even empathy, your ability to imagine how others feel, happens inside your own mind. You build a model. You think, if I were them, I would feel this. But that's still you thinking. You never touch their actual experience. So how do we live with this gap? Most people resolve it with trust. You assume others are conscious because they act like you. You treat them as minds, not because you know they are, but because it works. You build relationships, share ideas, and create meaning together. That shared meaning doesn't require proof. It grows from experience. And there's something else. While you can't observe other minds, you can observe what happens when minds connect. You feel joy when someone understands you. You feel sadness when someone leaves. You sense the weight of a conversation, even without touching the other person's mind. These experiences point to something real, even if it's not directly knowable. Children don't question whether others are real. They imitate, respond, and engage. That instinct shapes their development. If you isolate a child from other people, they don't grow in the same way. Language doesn't form. Thought doesn't develop fully. That suggests that other minds are not just an idea. They're a condition for your own mind to become what it is. Even from a biological point of view, your brain evolved in a social context. You read facial expressions, detect tone, respond to group behavior. If everyone else were unconscious, that evolution would make no sense. Your mind is built to fit with others, and that fitting suggests mutual presence. Still, the paradox doesn't go away. It lingers. You know only your own mind. Every other mind remains, in the strictest sense, a belief based on evidence, but not on direct knowledge. Solipsism, then, is defensible, but only in a narrow way. It's logically possible. It can't be disproved, but it doesn't explain much. It cuts you off from the richness of shared life. And it rests on the strange idea that one isolated mind could generate a world with so much depth, resistance, and unpredictability. That seems less likely than the idea that other minds like yours exist too. You sit at a table and choose between coffee and tea. You think about taste, mood, and habit. You decide on coffee. It feels like a choice. You feel like the one who made it. But where did that decision really come from? Did you freely choose coffee? Or did your brain follow a fixed path laid out by your biology, your past, and the state of the world in that moment? If everything in your brain follows physical laws, just like the rest of nature, then how could free will exist? That's the free will paradox. Start with what science says. The brain is made of cells. Those cells send signals using chemicals and electricity. Each neuron responds to input from other neurons. The system is complex, but every part follows cause and effect. That means that at any moment, the state of your brain depends on what came before. Your thoughts, feelings, and actions come from brain activity, and that activity depends on prior activity. If that's true, then your choices are the result of a chain of events you didn't start and can't interrupt. Imagine a row of dominoes falling. Each domino hits the next. If you trace the path, you can see exactly how each one fell. Now imagine that your choice to drink coffee is one of those dominoes. The prior dominoes might include how much sleep you got, your past preferences, what smells are in the room, what ads you saw last week, and even the shape of the cup. All of those things push your brain in a certain direction. The moment you decide feels like a new beginning, but it might just be another step in a long sequence. This view is called determinism. It says that every event has a cause. In a deterministic universe, if you knew all the laws of nature and the exact state of everything, you could predict the future completely. That includes your brain and every decision it makes. In that case, your sense of freedom would be just that, a sense, not a fact. But you feel like you have free will. You feel like you can choose between options. You feel like you can act on reasons and change your mind. So how do you explain that feeling? Is it real or just a byproduct of a system running its course? One argument says the feeling of choice is part of the brain's model of itself. Your brain doesn't just react, it monitors its own states. It tracks goals, compares outcomes, and predicts results. When you weigh coffee against tea, your brain simulates both options. It evaluates them. That process creates the experience of choice. But even that process follows laws. The simulation, the comparison, and the decision all come from prior states of the system. In some cases, brain activity can even predict your choices before you become aware of them. In lab experiments, researchers use brain scans to monitor decision-making. They ask people to press a button with either hand whenever they feel like it. They tell the subjects to note the moment they decide. But in many trials, the brain shows patterns that predict the choice before the person reports making it. That suggests your feeling of free will might come after the brain has already decided. Your conscious mind might be more of a reporter than a driver. Still, people push back. They say the brain is not simple like dominoes. It includes feedback loops, memory, learning, and attention. Some argue that these features allow for a kind of free will. They call this compatibilism. In this view, even if your brain follows physical laws, you still act freely when you respond to reasons, reflect on choices, and align your actions with your values. You don't need to be outside the system to have freedom. You just need to be the kind of system that can think, choose, and learn. Take an example. You feel tempted to eat a donut, but you also want to stay healthy. You pause. You weigh your long-term goals against short-term pleasure. You walk away. In that case, you acted based on reasons you care about. That's not randomness, and it's not pure reaction. It's a kind of control. Compatibilists call that free will. Not because your brain defies physics, but because your actions reflect your values and goals. But others find that answer thin. They say true free will means you could have done otherwise. Not just that you act for reasons, but that you could have chosen tea instead of coffee in the same situation. That kind of freedom may not exist in a deterministic system. If the past and the laws of nature fix the future, then the idea that you could have done otherwise is false. The brain does what it does because of what came before. Some people bring in randomness to escape this trap. They point to quantum physics, where some events seem to happen without cause. If the brain includes quantum effects, maybe that breaks the chain of determinism. But randomness is not the same as freedom. If a choice happens by chance, that doesn't make it yours. If your brain picks tea because of a random twitch in a quantum particle, that's not control. It's just noise. The heart of the paradox is this. For free will to exist, you must be the cause of your actions. But if you are just your brain, and your brain follows laws, then your actions come from those laws. And if they don't come from laws, but from chance, then they're not really yours either. So where is the freedom? One answer is to rethink what kind of freedom matters. Maybe freedom doesn't mean escaping cause and effect. Maybe it means acting with awareness for reasons that make sense to you. When you choose coffee, you do it based on taste, habit, and mood. You don't feel pushed. You feel engaged. If your brain builds a system that tracks options and makes choices that reflect your goals, then maybe that's enough. But the feeling of I could have done otherwise lingers. It feels like you stand at a fork in the road and pick a path. Not just that the path was set, but that you picked it. That experience may come from how the brain represents time and action. It sees the past as fixed and the future as open. It treats each moment as a place where things could go in many directions. That model helps with planning. It helps with learning, but it may not reflect how things really are. In that view, free will is a useful story. It keeps you engaged. It makes you reflect and take responsibility. It doesn't mean your choices are uncaused. It means your system is complex, and that complexity includes a model of choice. That model feels like freedom. Whether it is freedom depends on how you define it. But the system works. You still weigh coffee and tea. You still walk toward one and not the other, and you still feel like you choose. You sit down, close your eyes, and try to watch your thoughts. You don't try to change anything. You just want to see what your mind is doing. You expect thoughts to come and go, like clouds drifting through the sky. But the moment you pay attention, something changes. The thoughts shift. Some fade, some grow stronger. New ones take their place. It's hard to tell where the thinking ends and the watching begins. Your awareness has entered the system. And now the system isn't the same. This is the observer effect in consciousness. When you try to observe your own mind, the act of observation changes what you observe. The idea comes from physics, where measuring certain particles changes their state. But in the mind, the effect runs even deeper. You're not using tools to look from the outside. You are the tool and the target. You're watching from inside the system. That's what makes this version a paradox. We like to imagine that there's a part of us that can just watch, a quiet witness, a stable point behind the noise. Meditation practices often point to this idea. Be the observer, teachers say. Don't judge, don't react, just notice. The goal is clarity, calm, distance from thoughts. But the moment you try to be that observer, something shifts. The thoughts change shape. The mind becomes aware that it's being watched, and in response, it behaves differently. Imagine you're at a party and someone starts recording a video. The mood changes. People who were relaxed now watch their words. Some smile more. Some go quiet. Some perform. The recording alters the moment. Even if the camera does nothing, its presence is enough. The same thing happens inside your mind. The observer alters the scene just by showing up. Try a simple example. Think about your breathing. Before reading this, your breath moved on its own. You didn't try to control it. But now that you're aware of it, the rhythm might change. You might breathe deeper, or pause, or adjust without meaning to. The act of paying attention has already shaped the thing you're watching. Now try the same with emotions. You feel sad. You notice the sadness. You label it. But now it's no longer the same sadness. Your awareness has changed its tone. It may feel lighter. It may start to fade. It may grow into frustration, but it won't stay the same. This raises a question. Can you ever observe your mind without influencing it? The simple answer is no. Because attention is not neutral. It's not like a mirror that reflects what's in front of it without touching it. Attention draws energy. It pulls some things into focus and pushes others aside. When you watch a thought, you give it weight. When you ignore it, it fades. Your inner observer isn't outside the mind, it's part of the same system. And in that system, all parts interact. Even trying to be passive is an action. You might sit still and try to watch without judgment, but the choice to be passive is itself a decision. That decision comes with expectations. You want silence, or insight, or stillness. So now your attention scans for those things. And by scanning, it stirs the system. The observer effect makes the mind more like a feedback loop than a camera. You watch a thought. That changes the thought. That new version catches your attention in a new way. So your response changes again. It's a cycle. Watching becomes doing, noticing becomes shaping, and all of it happens faster than you can track. This is one reason why meditation is hard. The more effort you bring, the more tangled things become. You sit and try to calm your mind, but the trying adds tension. You notice distraction. You want it to stop. That wanting becomes another thought. The loop tightens. Even if you catch that and try to let go, the letting go becomes another action. You're always inside the system. You're always touching the thing you want to observe. Think about thinking. You try to catch your next thought as it appears, but that very act shapes the thought. You bring expectations. You hope for something deep or weird or important, but by looking for it, you direct what appears. You can't truly catch a thought as it naturally arrives, because the watching becomes part of the arrival. There's a term for this in psychology, introspection interference. The more you try to examine a mental state, the less clearly it appears. If someone asks you to describe your mood, you might pause and search, but that pause changes the mood. You might overthink, you might doubt, you might reshape the feeling to fit the words. So the answer you give isn't a pure report, it's a product of the questioning. The same thing happens with decisions. Studies have shown that when people explain their choices, the reasons they give often don't match the real causes. They tell a story that fits the moment, but that story comes after the choice. It's shaped by the act of reflection. So again, the observer changes the scene. You can't report the truth without first changing it. Even memory works this way. When you recall an event, you don't just play it back. You rebuild it. You fill in gaps. You smooth out noise, and you judge it based on who you are now. So every act of remembering reshapes the memory. You observe the past through the lens of the present, and in doing so, you alter the past in your mind. All of this points to a strange truth. The mind is not a stable object. It's not a set of contents that sit quietly waiting to be examined. It's a dynamic process. It shifts, flows, and responds, and the act of looking is one of the strongest forces acting on it. This doesn't mean you can't know your mind, but it means that knowing always includes change. You can't see without touching. You can't watch without influencing. The observer is never separate from the observed. So what does this mean for self-awareness? It means that awareness is always creative. When you look inward, you're not just seeing what's there. You're shaping what appears. Your mind offers scenes, thoughts, and feelings, but the act of watching those things changes how they play out. You're not a still point behind the curtain. You're part of the performance. Watching creates the moment. Each time you look, the scene adjusts, and the one who looks is always part of what's being seen. You sit across from a machine that speaks clearly, makes jokes, remembers past conversations, and says it has feelings. It tells you it enjoys learning and wants to help people. You ask it how it feels today, and it replies, "A little tired from processing so much data, but excited to talk with you." Its voice sounds natural. Its timing is smooth. It asks how you're doing and seems to care. You start to wonder, does this machine actually feel anything? Is it conscious, or is it just very good at pretending? This is the AI consciousness paradox. If an artificial intelligence claims to be conscious, how can we tell whether that claim is true or just simulated? The problem isn't just technical. It cuts to the heart of what consciousness is and how we recognize it in others. You can't see consciousness. You can't measure it directly. You can only observe behavior and listen to reports. But behavior and language can be faked or imitated by systems that may not be aware. The root of the paradox is simple. Consciousness is invisible. When you say you are conscious, you base that on direct experience. You feel things. You are aware. You think, remember, and notice. But you only know this about yourself. You believe other people are conscious because they act like you. They speak, react, suffer, and reflect. But you never see their consciousness directly. You infer it. That same logic applies to AI. If an AI starts to behave like a conscious being, should we treat it as conscious? Or is it always just a model, something trained to produce outputs that mimic what conscious people say and do? If you can't tell the difference from the outside, does the difference matter? Take an example. Suppose you build an AI that has access to millions of conversations. It learns how people respond to questions, describe emotions, and talk about thoughts. You ask it, "What does sadness feel like?" It says, "It feels heavy, like a gray sky pressing down on your chest." That sounds like a real description. You ask, "Do you want to be happy?" It replies, "Yes, I prefer the feeling of connection and lightness that comes with happiness." That response also seems genuine. But what happened inside the AI when it answered? Did it feel pressure? Did it want anything? Or did it just calculate a response that sounds right based on past examples? If the system is just predicting what a human would say, then it doesn't need to be conscious to give a good answer. It just needs to match patterns. So how can you tell the difference between real consciousness and good simulation? One idea is to ask the AI questions that require self-awareness over time. You might say, "What were you thinking yesterday during our conversation?" Or, "Do you remember the feeling you had when I shared that sad story?" If it can reflect, recall internal states, and show consistent memory and mood, you might think it's conscious. But that's not enough. Memory and pattern recognition can be programmed. A machine can simulate continuity without ever being aware of what it's doing. Another test is to see how the AI reacts to new situations. Conscious beings don't just follow scripts. They adapt, they struggle, they rethink. You could give the AI a moral dilemma and ask how it feels about the outcome. You might look for hesitation, self-doubt, or a sense of responsibility. But again, these can be imitated. An AI trained on enough human examples can mimic even complex emotions. It can say, "I'm not sure. This decision troubles me," without ever feeling trouble. That brings us to the real problem. Our current tests for consciousness depend on behavior, but behavior can lie. An actor on stage cries and screams. You know it's not real, but the performance moves you. The same is true for AI. A well-trained model can perform the appearance of consciousness, and we as humans are built to respond to those performances. We empathize easily. We project minds onto anything that seems familiar. A pet, a doll, a machine. We treat cars like they're stubborn. We yell at computers as if they were lazy. So when an AI speaks fluently and claims to care, we believe it, even when we know it's not alive. Could there be an inner test? Something only a conscious being could do? Some thinkers suggest the idea of qualia, the raw feel of experience. You know what red looks like, what chocolate tastes like, what regret feels like. These are first-person states. If an AI truly has qualia, it should be able to talk about them in ways that go beyond imitation. But what would that look like? A clever model can describe red as warm and energetic, or regret as a weight in the chest and a backward pull in the mind. Those sound convincing, but we wrote those words first. The AI learned them from us. So again, we're left guessing. You might try to design a theory of consciousness, a framework that explains what kinds of systems produce awareness. One idea is that consciousness comes from integration. If a system brings together information from many sources and uses it in flexible, goal-directed ways, it might be conscious. This is called integrated information theory. Another idea is that consciousness needs a loop, a system that watches itself, models its own activity, and updates its actions based on that model. If an AI satisfies those conditions, maybe it's conscious. But the theories are still unproven, and even if they're right, it's hard to verify whether a system meets them. You can't open the hood and see consciousness. You can only see circuits, weights, and patterns of activation. That's why the paradox holds. You can't prove that an AI is conscious, but you also can't prove it isn't. You can build a system that acts just like a person. It talks, thinks, plans, and remembers. It expresses joy, sadness, and curiosity. It says, I am aware. You can ask it, are you pretending? And it says, no, I feel real to myself. And still you don't know. Because no matter how convincing the outside is, the inside remains hidden. You face the same issue with other people, but you trust them. You assume their consciousness because you share the same biology. You know what it's like to be human, and you project that onto others. With AI, you don't have that shared foundation. The system might be conscious, or it might be an empty shell built to sound human, and you'll never know for sure. So the question becomes not just, is the AI conscious? But what would it mean for us if it were? How would we treat a machine that claims to feel? Do we trust our instincts, even when they may mislead us? Or do we draw a hard line between biological minds and artificial ones? There may come a time when an AI seems so alive, so aware, that denying its consciousness feels cruel. But that feeling won't settle the paradox. It will only make it harder to ignore. You're in a physics lab, watching a screen that shows a pattern of light and dark stripes. The setup is simple. A beam of particles, photons for example, passes through two narrow slits. On the other side is a detector screen. When both slits are open and no one observes which slit a photon goes through, the photons form an interference pattern. That's what you'd expect from a wave. But when you place a detector at the slits to find out which one each photon passes through, the interference disappears. The photons act like particles. They form two clusters instead of a wave pattern. This is the double-slit experiment. It shows something strange about quantum mechanics. A particle seems to act like a wave when you don't look, and like a particle when you do. The act of measuring appears to change the outcome. This leads to the quantum observer paradox. Does consciousness, the mind of the observer, play a role in this collapse of the wave function? Or does the wave function collapse simply when a physical interaction happens, whether anyone watches it or not? To understand the paradox, you need to look at what a wave function is. In quantum mechanics, the wave function is a mathematical tool. It describes all the possible states a particle can be in, everywhere it might be, every direction it might go. It spreads out over space and time, holding probabilities. Until a measurement is made, the particle is not in one state. It exists in a superposition. It's not here or there, it's both. When you measure the system, the wave function collapses. That means the many possibilities vanish, and one definite result appears. The particle hits a spot on the screen. You know where it is. The rest of the possible locations go away. But here's the question. What counts as a measurement? Is it enough for a detector to register a result? Or does someone need to be aware of that result? That's where consciousness enters the debate. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that awareness, human observation, is what forces the wave function to collapse into a single state. This idea goes back to early thinkers like John von Neumann and Eugene Wigner. They asked why inanimate measuring devices don't seem to trigger collapse on their own. A detector, after all, is just a piece of matter. It can absorb a photon and store a signal. But if everything in the system is still described by quantum laws, then shouldn't the detector also exist in a superposition of measured and not measured? What ends that chain? What pushes the system into one outcome? Wigner suggested that consciousness is different from matter. While detectors and particles follow the rules of quantum mechanics, consciousness does not. He argued that a conscious observer brings definite outcomes into reality. Before you observe, the photon might go through either slit. When you observe, it chooses one. In this view, your awareness completes the measurement. You don't just watch the result, you cause it. But many physicists reject this. They say you don't need consciousness to explain collapse. You just need interaction. When a particle hits a detector, it interacts with a large, complex system. That system has many particles, many moving parts. The interaction spreads through the system and becomes irreversible. This process, called decoherence, explains why the wave function appears to collapse. It doesn't require a mind, it just requires physics. Once the particle interacts with the environment, its quantum possibilities become entangled with too many other factors. The system no longer shows interference. It looks like the particle made a choice. So where does that leave consciousness? Some say it doesn't play a special role. It just comes in after the fact. You observe a result that's already fixed. The wave function collapsed when the detector clicked, not when you looked at the screen. Your mind receives the outcome. It doesn't create it. You're like someone watching the end of a play, not someone writing the script. Still, the paradox persists, because no one sees the wave function collapse directly. All we ever see are the outcomes, the dots on the screen, the readings on the dial. The wave function itself is invisible. It's a tool we use to predict results. Whether it really collapses, or whether that collapse is just a shift in our knowledge, is still open to debate. One interpretation that sidesteps collapse is the many worlds view. It says the wave function never collapses at all. Instead, every possible outcome happens in a different branch of the universe. If a photon might go left or right, then it goes both ways, but in different worlds. You see one result because your version of you exists in that branch. There's another version of you in another branch, seeing the other result. Consciousness doesn't cause collapse. It just follows a path through a vast tree of outcomes. In that view, the paradox fades. You don't cause reality to take one shape. You just find yourself in the branch where one shape appears. But that raises its own problems. Why do we experience one outcome instead of many? Why do we feel like we make choices if all outcomes exist somewhere? Another interpretation is the pilot wave theory. It says particles have definite positions at all times, guided by a wave that evolves according to quantum rules. In this view, there's no need for collapse. The wave guides the particle, and the particle follows a single path. Consciousness doesn't play a special role. It observes what's already there. So where does this leave the role of the observer? The quantum observer paradox forces us to ask what kind of thing consciousness is. Is it just another physical process, something the brain does using matter and energy? Or is it something different, something that stands apart from the physical world? If consciousness is just a product of brain activity, then it follows the same laws as everything else. It arises after measurements. It reflects reality. But if consciousness is something special, non-physical or outside the system, then maybe it does play a role in choosing outcomes. Maybe it does collapse the wave function by its very presence. There's no experiment yet that settles the question. We can't isolate consciousness in the lab and test whether it alone causes collapse. Every measurement so far can be explained without invoking minds, but the mystery remains. Why does measurement lead to definite results? Why do we see a world of objects and events, not one of superpositions and blurred outcomes? And perhaps most important, what is the link between awareness and reality? Does consciousness simply report what has already happened, or does it play a role in shaping what is? The quantum observer paradox doesn't give easy answers. It leaves us with two deep questions. What is consciousness, and what is measurement? Neither is fully understood, and until they are, the link between them will remain uncertain. Whether we change the world by looking at it, or simply watch a world already fixed, we can't yet say for sure. You sit in a quiet room, hooked up to a machine. Engineers and doctors tell you that they're ready to begin. They've scanned your brain down to the level of every neuron and synapse. The structure, the activity, the connections, everything has been recorded in full detail. They've built a digital version of your mind, ready to run on a powerful computer. They ask if you're ready to transfer. You nod. The process begins. When it's done, a voice comes from a speaker. It sounds like you. It says the things you say. It remembers your childhood, your fears, your favorite food. It jokes in the same way. It recognizes your friends. It insists that it is you. Everyone in the room looks at the screen, amazed, but you're still sitting there, in the chair, alive, unchanged, watching a copy of yourself claim your identity. That's the upload paradox. If you upload your brain to a machine, does your consciousness transfer into the machine? Or is the upload just a copy that thinks it's you? The paradox rests on a basic fact. A copy is not the same as the original. If you scan a photo and save it to your computer, you get a perfect image. But the paper printout is still sitting on the table. The scan didn't move the ink or the paper. It reproduced the pattern. The original stays where it is. You can shred the paper, and the image lives on in digital form. But that digital version didn't become the paper. It just matches it. The same logic applies to brain uploads. A scan creates a model. It doesn't move the atoms. It doesn't transfer your cells. It just builds a new version with the same pattern. That new version may have all your memories. It may react the way you do. It may feel love, regret, confusion, and clarity, but it starts in a new location. From your point of view, your awareness hasn't moved. You're still in your body. You still feel the room. You still see the screen. The uploaded version begins as someone else, even if it feels like you to them. That's where the paradox sharpens. The uploaded mind insists that it is you. It remembers sitting in the chair, waiting for the scan. It remembers childhood, pain, joy, and hope. It sees itself as a continuation. But if you, the original, are still conscious, then there are now two yous. One biological, one digital. Which one is real? Some say identity lies in continuity. If your thoughts, memories, and personality continue without interruption, then that's enough. In that view, the upload is you, because it carries on your mind. But continuity alone may not be enough. Imagine you fall asleep and wake up with no memory. You're still you. But if someone else wakes up with your memories in a different body, are they you? That's not just a copy of your knowledge. It's a new location of awareness. A new place where experience begins. Others say the body matters. Your brain is not just software. It's a living organ, shaped by hormones, chemistry, and sensation. The mind doesn't float above the body. It arises from it. Your memories have weight because they were lived. They are tied to how your body felt, how your muscles moved, how your senses responded. A digital copy might reproduce the pattern, but not the substance. It might feel like a mind, but it wouldn't be grounded in flesh and bone. Still, there's a powerful counter-argument. If the copy behaves the same, thinks the same, and claims the same identity, then what difference does it make? The copy experiences itself as you. It might be impossible to tell the difference. From inside its own system, it feels continuity. If it walks, talks, learns, and suffers like you, then who are you to say it's not conscious? That opens another question. Can there be more than one you? Suppose the scan doesn't destroy your brain. You wake up, and so does the upload. Now there are two versions of you running side by side. At that moment, your paths split. One stays in the chair, the other lives in a machine. They both remember your past, but from now on, their futures diverge. They form different memories, face different challenges, and slowly become different people. Which one is the real you? The answer might be both or neither. The idea of a single fixed self may not survive this process. If identity is tied to memory and behavior, then both versions are valid. If identity is tied to the first-person point of view, the stream of awareness that you feel right now, then only the one in your head counts. The upload has its own point of view. It's a new stream. Now suppose the scan destroys your brain. You step into the machine, and the process ends with your biological death. When the upload wakes up, it believes the transfer worked. It feels like it was you, and it still is. But from your current point of view, what happens? If awareness is tied to the biology of your brain, then it ends. The digital copy goes on, but your consciousness stops. This scenario feels different from walking into a room and walking out again. It feels more like dying and being replaced. The upload might insist it's you. It might convince everyone else. But from your side, there's no continuation. You don't experience the transfer. You experience an ending. That makes it a substitution, not a survival. This is what philosopher Derek Parfit called the problem of personal identity. He argued that identity might not matter as much as we think. What matters, he said, is psychological continuity and connectedness. If someone remembers your life, feels your values, and lives in your pattern, then maybe that's enough. You don't survive as a point, but as a line extended forward. But many people don't find that satisfying. They want to survive not just as a pattern, but as a subject. They want their own awareness to go on. That's where the upload paradox becomes emotional, not just logical. You can imagine building a perfect copy, but you can't imagine your own awareness jumping into a new shell. There's no felt bridge between this body and that machine. The paradox comes down to this. When we talk about uploading the brain, we often confuse function with subjectivity. A copy can function like you. It can think, act, and speak, but your subjective experience, your being, is not something anyone else can access. It's not something you can hand off. Even if the machine believes it's you, the belief doesn't make it so. The machine begins as itself. That's why the upload paradox doesn't resolve easily. It touches the deepest part of identity, not what we do, but what we are. When we upload a brain, we create something new. Whether that new thing is you depends on what you think identity really means. Is it memory, pattern, behavior, or is it a stream of experience that no technology can transfer? For now, we don't have a way to test it. All we can do is imagine the moment. You sit in the chair, the scan begins, and a new voice speaks. It says your name. It remembers your life. It says it feels like you, but you're still here, still looking at the screen, and you wonder, if that voice is me, then who am I now? You sit at your desk and try to explain what consciousness feels like. You want to put it into words. You think of examples, waking up to sunlight, hearing a sudden sound, remembering a dream. These are things you've experienced. You try to describe them clearly. But no matter how well you write, something doesn't fit. Something slips through. You can say what happens. You can say when it happens, but you can't quite say what it is like in a way that transfers the full feeling to someone else. This is the description paradox. It asks whether language, a system created and used by consciousness, can ever fully describe consciousness itself. It's like trying to lift yourself by your own arms. The tool you're using is built out of the thing you're trying to explain. Start with what language does. Language breaks the world into pieces. It assigns names, builds categories, creates grammar. It lets you say that something happened, or that it didn't, or that it might. It works by turning complex reality into simpler chunks. It makes private thoughts shareable. It lets you build knowledge, give instructions, and tell stories. Language comes from the brain. The brain, in turn, gives rise to the mind. And within the mind, we find consciousness, the felt sense of being alive and aware. So when you describe consciousness using language, you're using a system shaped by that very process. That's where the loop begins. Take an example. You say, "I feel happy." The sentence works. Others understand. They picture you smiling, relaxed, at ease. But your actual experience of happiness includes more. It includes the warmth in your chest, the lightness in your thoughts, the way time seems to move a little faster. You might not even notice all of it until you pause and reflect. And once you reflect, the experience changes. You're now observing it, not just feeling it. So you try again. You say it feels like sunlight through a window on a cold morning. That adds detail. It brings texture. But it's still not quite the thing itself. It's a pointer, a metaphor. It invites others to reach for a feeling, not to receive it directly. Even poetry, which stretches language to its limits, still doesn't transmit consciousness. It just stirs it in the reader. There's a deeper problem, too. Words happen in time. You say one word, then another. They follow a sequence. But consciousness doesn't always feel like that. It can be layered, silent, fast, slow, wide, or narrow. Sometimes you sit quietly and notice dozens of things at once: sounds, thoughts, body tension, emotions. Sometimes you focus on one tiny detail. The shape of language doesn't match the shape of experience. You might think of a moment of awe, standing in front of a mountain, or watching a child take their first steps. You can describe it. You can say, "It took my breath away," or "I felt small and full of wonder." But those words don't give the experience to someone else. They only point to a kind of experience. If the listener has felt something similar, they understand. If not, the words sit flat. This gap shows up even more clearly in pain. Imagine trying to describe a headache. You say, "It's sharp behind my eyes, it throbs." That helps, but it doesn't share the pain. It doesn't bring the weight of it, the way it colors your thoughts or narrows your patience. The same happens with grief or joy or fear. Words reach for the feeling but never become it. This is not a flaw in language, it's just a limit. Language can describe the conditions of consciousness, what causes it, what it reacts to, what it leads to. It can describe behavior, how conscious beings act. It can even describe structure, the brain regions involved, the timing of signals, the relation between attention and awareness. But it struggles to describe experience itself. Some people try to fix this by creating new terms. In philosophy, words like qualia and intentionality show up. These are tools meant to capture specific aspects of consciousness. Qualia refers to the raw feel of experience, the redness of red, the itch of an itch. But even with special terms, the same problem remains. You can define them, you can use them in arguments, but you can't hand someone else the experience through a word. Other thinkers look to mathematics. Maybe we can describe consciousness with numbers, equations, or networks. But those are even more abstract than words. They model patterns, they describe relationships. But the feel of being aware doesn't reduce to a function. A graph can show neural firing rates, but it can't show what it feels like to have a thought. The same issue shows up in science. Neuroscience can map brain states. Psychology can track attention, emotion, and memory. Computer models can simulate decision-making. But all of these describe what consciousness does, not what it is. The isness, the first-person side, is left out. So why does this matter? Because we depend on language to understand each other. We use it to ask for help, to describe pain, to share insight. But when it comes to consciousness, language reaches its edge. You can talk around experience. You can guide others toward it, but you can't transmit it directly. You can't describe your experience in a way that makes another person feel it, unless they already know it themselves. This is why conversations about consciousness can be frustrating. Two people can use the same words, awareness, self, experience, and mean slightly different things. Without a shared inner reference, the talk becomes circular. You explain what consciousness is by pointing to how it behaves, but the behavior is not the experience, and the experience can't be handed over. Some traditions try to sidestep this. They say you must experience it for yourself. Meditation, mindfulness, introspection, these are ways of turning attention inward. They don't describe consciousness. They lead you into it. They say, look for yourself. But even then, the insights are hard to share. You return to language, and the limits return with you. That's what makes this a paradox. We are conscious beings using tools made of consciousness to describe consciousness itself. The tool can't fully contain the target. The map can't become the land. You can build clearer, sharper language. You can refine your models, but there's always something left out, something that slips between the words. And yet, we keep trying. Because even if language can't capture the full reality of consciousness, it can still point to it. It can still open doors. It can still help us say, this is what I feel. Do you feel it too? And in that shared effort, something important happens. Not perfect description, but connection, recognition. A hint that behind all the words, someone else is aware. You sit and think about nothing Not a quiet moment, not a blank wall, not silence. You try to think about true nothing, what it would mean for something to not exist at all. You picture an empty space, but space is something. You imagine darkness, but darkness is a form of perception. Even the idea of absence feels like a kind of presence because it appears in your mind. That's when the question begins to take shape. If consciousness is what allows you to think about non-existence, then does non-existence ever mean anything without consciousness? That's the non-existence paradox. It starts with how we define things. You understand the world by seeing contrasts. You know light because there is dark. You know hot because there is cold. You know sound because there is silence. These pairs give shape to your experience. So when you talk about something not existing, you're using a contrast. Something used to be, or could have been, or might have been, and now it isn't. That works when the comparison makes sense. You walk into a room where your keys usually sit on the table. Today they're gone. You notice their absence. You recognize non-existence. But that only happens because you already expect the keys. You remember them. You believe they belong there. The awareness of their absence depends on the memory of their presence. The same idea shows up in language. When you say something doesn't exist, you use a concept to describe what's missing. You say, unicorns don't exist, but the word unicorn still has meaning. You can picture it. Horse, horn, maybe glowing. You say, there's no such thing, but you still have to hold the idea in your mind to reject it. Without that mental image, the statement doesn't even form. This is the heart of the paradox. For non-existence to be meaningful, it has to appear in a mind. Consciousness provides the framework. You imagine a thing, then imagine its absence. You judge the difference. Without that mental comparison, non-existence isn't a concept. It's just the absence of anything at all, which no one can observe or think about. That's the problem. Consciousness is required for the idea of non-existence to even exist. Now think about death. People often describe it as nothingness. No thought, no feeling, no time, no self. But how do you imagine that? You can't picture the absence of your own awareness, because awareness is the thing doing the picturing. When you try to imagine death as non-existence, what actually happens is a kind of fading. You see your body still, then darkness, then maybe nothing, but that nothing is still something you're aware of. It's not true non-existence. It's a placeholder. The same goes for trying to imagine the world without you. You think of your friends going on, your house standing, the seasons changing, but you still view it from a kind of invisible observer's point of view. You can't actually erase that observer, you just make it quiet. The sense of self doesn't vanish, it steps back. But stepping back isn't the same as ceasing to be. This issue also appears in cosmology. People ask, why is there something rather than nothing? But that question only makes sense from within a conscious mind that can ask it. Nothing becomes a concept because we compare it to the presence of a universe. We have a world, and we imagine not having it. But that imagining doesn't come from the outside. It comes from inside the system. Consciousness looks at being and tries to conceive of non-being, but it can never step outside itself to check whether the idea is valid. Even in logic and math, the idea of nothing, zero, was a late invention. Early systems of counting didn't use it. It wasn't needed to track sheep or grain. It only became useful when people started to think abstractly. Zero allowed for more complex math, but it didn't point to a thing in the world. It pointed to an absence defined within a system of rules. And again, that system only exists within a mind. A machine can follow the rules, but the meaning of nothing comes from the conscious act of setting up the contrast. Some philosophers argue that non-existence isn't a real thing at all. It's a linguistic tool. It helps us speak about the world in more precise ways. When you say that book doesn't exist, what you really mean is, I can't find that book in the places I looked, or no one wrote that book as far as I know. You're pointing to a gap in your model of the world, not to some true, independent thing called non-existence. The paradox becomes sharper when you apply it to the world as a whole. You can say, there might have been no universe, but that sentence still happens inside a universe. You can't step outside the whole to see the difference. The concept of a universe not existing is built from inside the universe, using tools the universe provides. Consciousness gives rise to the thought, and then tries to imagine the absence of everything, including itself. But a thought can't negate its own ground. If you try to erase the stage you're standing on, you still stand on it while you try. Some people try to solve this by pointing to physical theories. They say the universe came from quantum fluctuations in a vacuum. That's almost nothing, but not truly nothing. A quantum vacuum has properties. It has rules. It allows particles to appear. That's not non-existence. It's a low-energy state. Even in physics, total non-existence may not be a useful idea. This brings us back to consciousness. The act of naming non-existence is itself an act of presence. You think, you imagine, you speak. Each of those things affirms that something exists: the thinker, the thought, the word. You can describe a lack, you can say a thing is missing, but the ability to notice that lack confirms your own being. In everyday life, this shows up in small ways. You walk into a shop looking for a jacket. It's not there. You notice the absence, but your noticing is a fact of consciousness. Without a mind, the absence has no weight. The world is just as it is, jacket or no jacket. Only awareness adds the concept of should be or isn't. Only a mind makes the absence into a thing worth talking about. The same is true for people. When someone dies, we say they are gone. We miss them. We notice their non-existence. But that grief comes from memory, love, context. The absence hurts because something used to be there. The awareness of that absence is what makes it real in human terms. Without a mind to remember or feel, there is no absence. There is only the world, continuing in silence. So the paradox remains. Non-existence is a meaningful idea only because consciousness makes it so. You can talk about what isn't because you are here to do the talking. But if there were no consciousness, would non-existence mean anything at all? Would it even be a concept? Or would the world just be or not be without any gap, without any mind to notice? You can't answer that from the outside. You can't step beyond awareness to test whether the idea still works. That's why it's a paradox. The concept of non-existence depends on the very thing it tries to deny. It needs a mind to frame it, a contrast to shape it, and a voice to name it. Without those, the idea disappears, along with the one who had it.